Something doesn't add up here, and it's been bugging me for weeks. How did Native American tribes survive in places where even modern technology fails? In this video, I'm sharing the unbelievable truth about these ancient survival masters that will blow your mind. What you're about to discover will literally change how you see human potential forever. This journey into their secret world starts now. But before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more mind-blowing history, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. The land is wide, barren, stark, a silence so absolute it hums in the ears. Above the dry sea of sagebrush and volcanic rock, the Warner Mountains stand like ancient watchmen, peaks bruised by time and weather, their ridgelines etched in jagged defiance against the western sky. This is not the kind of place most men choose. This is where they're sent, or where they end up when there's nowhere else to go. In the shadow of those windswept ranges, pressed against the distant rim of the Great Basin, lies a forgotten corner of the American frontier, Fort Bidwell. Once a lonely military outpost, now a whisper beneath layers of time and dust. But in the 1860s, this was the edge of everything. Here, the United States of America met the full measure of its ambition and its arrogance. Here, native nations clung to land, life, and legacy with the resolve of a people who'd endured for centuries. Here, settlers staked their dreams into soil that refused to yield. And here, soldiers kept watch with rifles in hand, unsure whether the enemy was beyond the hills or in their minds. The Modoc Plateau stretches outward in every direction, high desert country carved by volcanic fury, scorched by sun, swept by howling wind. The winters here are long and bitter, the summers are dry and cruel. To the untrained eye, this land seems lifeless. But look closer. The northern Paiute people, who called this place home long before any flag fluttered over its soil, saw what others could not. Springs are hidden in rocky clefts, bighorn sheep grazing along secret paths, roots and seeds buried beneath brittle earth, just waiting to be harvested by those who knew their rhythm. Their survival here wasn't accidental, it was ancestral. But by the middle of the 19th century, that ancient rhythm was shattered. The Civil War had ended. The Union, victorious but wounded, turned its gaze westward. The dream of manifest destiny, once just a rallying cry, now became policy. Land was to be taken, secured, civilized, and any people who stood in the way were to be moved, pacified, or broken. California had already boomed with gold and greed. Oregon was growing fast, but the in-between, this inland empire of desert and highland, remained unsettled, unclaimed by the government's hand. Yet rumors moved faster than maps. Whispers of fertile valleys, mineral wealth, and open range reached homesteaders with nothing to lose. And so they came. Wagon trains creaked across the dry lakes and alkali flats. Families huddled beneath canvas tents, clutching children against freezing winds. Oxen died in their yokes. Wheels splintered in lava fields. Every mile claimed a price. One settler, Martha Laughlin, whose journal survived in fragments, wrote, "The sky is so big it feels hollow, and still we must go on. We buried a child this morning. Fever from bad water. Sam carved a cross from willow. There are no trees for shade, no trees at all." The U.S. Army followed the settlers, but not to protect them from the land, not entirely. There was fear in Washington, fear of resistance. The Modoc War had exploded just a few years earlier to the south. A small band of native warriors, outnumbered and surrounded, had humiliated the army in the lava beds of Northern California. That war ended with blood and betrayal, but it left commanders cautious. The frontier, they decided, must be fortified. In 1865, with little ceremony and even less preparation, Fort Bidwell was commissioned. Named for General John Bidwell, a pioneer politician, the fort was carved into a land that had no interest in hosting it. The location was chosen not for comfort, but for control. a strategic point near the tri-border of California, Oregon, and Nevada, where tribal boundaries, settler roots, and government ambitions collided. The first garrison arrived that fall, a ragtag mix of infantrymen, veterans, and young recruits. They built crude barracks from local stone and pine hauled from distant ridges. The wind never stopped. Water was scarce. Supplies were delayed by weeks, sometimes months. Letters home arrived rarely, if at all. The fort was more prison than post, yet every soldier knew why they were there: to keep order, to show the flag, to tame the land and the people who had always called it home. But the land refused taming. Rations ran low. The salt pork rotted in barrels. Flour came infested with weevils. Rats nested in the bunks. By spring, more men had died from exposure and illness than from any skirmish. A young corporal named Elijah Vane wrote to his sister, "Tell mother not to worry. The sun burns as if to punish us, and the cold at night is a second punishment. But I have seen the red cliffs at dawn, and they are beautiful. Strange how a cruel place can also be holy." For the northern Paiute, this new structure of stone and iron on their land was not holy. It was a scar. And yet, they watched, waited, adapted. They were masters of patience, skilled at reading the rhythms of both nature and enemy. They had survived Spanish slavers, fur trappers, and miners. Now they would endure soldiers too. But trust was fragile. Treaties promised food and peace, but delivered broken words and spoiled rations. Some Paiute bands tried to live alongside the settlers, trading when they could. Others retreated into the high canyons. A few resisted outright, swift raids under moonlight, arrows loosed across frozen plains. Every shadow became a threat. Every stranger was suspect. Still, the fort endured. So did the town that slowly grew in its wake. Like a tree growing from a crack in stone, civilization, or what passed for it, began to take root. But the cost was steep, and the war, though never declared, was always simmering. Out here, survival wasn't just about food or fire. It was about knowing who to trust, how to read the sky, and when to remain still in the sagebrush while danger passed. It was about understanding that on this edge of everything, nothing came easy. Not peace, not safety, not even memory. Today, little remains of Fort Bidwell. The parade grounds are covered in weeds, the barracks long gone. The stories nearly vanished, save for those willing to listen. But if you walk the land at sunrise, when the wind is low and the sky blazes orange behind the mountains, you might still hear it. The echo of boots on dry ground, the creak of a wagon wheel, a voice carried on the wind, warning or welcoming, no one can say. This was the edge, not of a map, but of a way of life. And what happened here, between soldier and settler, tribe and government, man and wilderness, still echoes across the high desert, whether we remember it or not. Before the rifles, before the boots, before the stones of Fort Bidwell were ever stacked upon each other, there was silence, a silence shaped not by emptiness, but by balance. Long before maps carved borders into the Modoc Plateau, the land breathed under the care of the northern Paiute. To settlers, this place seemed forsaken, a high desert of burning days and freezing nights, where only dust, rock, and stubborn shrubs could survive. But to the Paiute, it was a living world, sacred, deliberate, and known. The mountains held stories, the wind carried voices, every spring, every basin, every shadowed canyon held purpose. This was not a land to be conquered, it was a land to be understood. The northern Paiute people didn't live in permanent villages. They moved with the seasons, weaving their lives into the patterns of nature. In spring, they followed melting snows into the uplands, where young roots and greens emerged from the soil. In summer, they camped along lake beds, netting fish and gathering berries. In autumn, they climbed the ridges to harvest pine nuts, a sacred food and staple. And in winter, They returned to the valleys, where brush shelters and rabbit skin blankets kept out the cold. They were masters of efficiency, survivalists before the word ever existed. Everything had a use. Nothing was wasted. A single jackrabbit, when caught, could yield meat for the pot, sinew for bowstrings, and fur for a section of a winter robe. These robes, stitched from hundreds of rabbit skins, sewn edge to edge, were marvels of frontier insulation. When layered, they trapped heat better than wool and shed moisture in the snow. Children were swaddled in them, elders slept beneath them, hunters wore them as camouflage against the rock and sage. But to catch a jackrabbit in the open, that required skill. The Paiutes set traps, simple in appearance, complex in design. Stone deadfall snares built from balanced slabs and clever triggers. Willow snares braided into nooses. And the most legendary of all, the communal rabbit drive. Entire groups would form human fences stretching across the flats. They'd beat the brush, shout, and funnel dozens of rabbits toward a central corral. Then the men, armed with throwing sticks called keller, would strike with deadly precision. The keller was carved from hardwood, straight, flat, and curved at the tip. Spun sideways like a boomerang, it could kill small game at 30 yards with a silent crack. No bullets, no powder. Just muscle and mastery. And then there were the pine nuts. Come September, the high ridges echoed with the soft sound of cones dropping. The Paiute climbed into the mountains with woven burden baskets strapped across their backs. They knocked the green cones from the trees and roasted them in fire pits, causing them to open like blossoms. Inside were the nuts, dense, oily, rich in calories, the perfect winter food. To gather them was labor, to store them was wisdom, but to know when the pines would bloom, that was tradition. The women sang to the trees, not for magic, but out of respect. The land gave only when it was honored. Their homes were simple, but effective. Domed huts made from willow frames, covered in brush, bark, or mats of tule reeds. Inside, the air was warm, the fire low, the walls whispering with the wind outside. They built sweat lodges by creeks. They planted nothing, yet harvested plenty. They read the stars not for escape, but for guidance. And above all, they listened. The land was not separate from the people. The land was the people. Every ridge had a name. Every trail held memory. In Paiute stories, the earth was born from coyotes' mischief, the lakes from ancient weeping, the mountains from battles between sky and stone. This was not folklore. This was survival, a way to pass knowledge when writing was done with voice, not ink. But as the 19th century grew darker, those stories began to bend under pressure. At first, the settlers came in trickles, fur trappers, white men with steel traps and greasy pelts. Then came prospectors, their eyes glinting like the gold they sought. Then wagon trains, dozens, hundreds. The northern Paiute watched from ridge and ravine as strangers carved wagon ruts into their sacred lands. These newcomers did not ask where the water ran or which plants healed fever. They cut down pine groves, they shot elk for sport, they left the bones behind. Where the Paiute had travelled with the season, the settlers staked fences into the earth, claiming what could not be owned. At first, the meetings were cautious. Trade was offered. Dried fish for flour, baskets for axes, but the balance was already shifting. With each new settler came new disease. With each treaty came lies. Some Paiute bands tried to adapt, learning English, sending their children to mission schools. Others retreated farther into the desert, living off the edge of memory. A few, desperate and enraged, struck back. A settler's diary from 1863 recounts the fear. 2 cattle gone this morning. Paiutes? Perhaps. There are shadows on the ridge again. Mary swears she heard singing in the night. But fear, too, is a kind of violence. It grows. It spreads. It justifies. And in time, the US Army came with its own idea of peace, the kind made with bayonets and borders. Even before Fort Bidwell's stones were laid, its shadow stretched across this land. It came in the form of scouts and surveyors, in maps drawn with ignorance, in commands written by men who had never seen the sunrise over the Warner Mountains, who had never felt the crackle of frost on pine needles or the hush of a Paiute song at twilight. And still, the Paiute endured. They changed routes, hid caches, taught the children in whispers. They stitched new robes from old lessons. They moved at night, read the stars, remembered what others forgot. One old man, known only in bureau records as Winnemucca Tom, reportedly said, "We do not need to write. The land remembers for us." But the land could not protect them from bullets, and soon those bullets would come. The tension now curled tight around the plateau like a winter storm. The Paiutes stood at the edge of erasure, the settlers stood at the edge of desperation, and the soldiers were coming to the edge of war. Before Fort Bidwell rose from stone and sweat, there was a world here, intricate, ancient, alive. Not empty, not savage, but full of knowledge carved not in books, but in bone and bark and breath. And though that world was pushed back, though it was bruised and battered and branded with names it never asked for, it did not vanish. It still lives, in the wind across the sage, in the shape of rabbit tracks across morning snow, in the silence between pine trees. The northern Paiute never left. They were here before the fort, and they will be here long after its last stone crumbles into dust. The fire didn't start on the Modoc Plateau. It sparked far to the south, in the twisted black lava beds of what is now Northern California. But fires, even the small ones, find wind. And by the time the embers reached the high desert, they were carried on the backs of rumors, riding shotgun with fear. It was 1872. The country had survived one war, the Civil War, but was walking headlong into others. Wars less organized, less declared, but no less violent. Battles not between armies and flags, but between a rising nation and the people it was determined to erase. At the heart of it was the Modoc War, a conflict born from displacement, betrayal, and desperation. The Modoc people, led by a war chief named Kintpuash, known to the whites as Captain Jack, had tried negotiation. They had tried relocation. They had signed treaties and kept to shrinking reservations. But hunger doesn't care about treaties, and sickness ignores government orders. So in 1870, when the Modoc left the barren Klamath Reservation and returned to their ancestral homeland near Tule Lake, they were called hostiles. When they built brush shelters and tried to fish the same waters their grandparents had fished, they were labeled rebels. And when soldiers came to move them again, they resisted. The result was one of the most infamous guerrilla campaigns in American history. 53 Modoc warriors, defending a labyrinth of lava tubes and jagged rock, held off over 1,000 US soldiers for months. They fought with muzzle loaders, stolen rifles, and sheer knowledge of the terrain. They vanished into cracks in the earth, emerged where no one expected, and struck like ghosts. At the Battle of the Stronghold, they killed dozens without losing a single man. They assassinated General Canby during peace talks, the only US general ever killed in an Indian war. And though they were eventually surrounded, starved out, and broken, their defiance echoed far beyond the battlefield. To Washington, to San Francisco, to every settler cabin from the Columbia River to the Mojave, the message was clear. The frontier was not yet safe. In the towns near the Oregon border, mail stopped arriving. Women slept with loaded pistols beneath their pillows. Livestock vanished from open ranges. Every smoke column on the horizon was a possible war party. Men gathered in barns and frontier chapels to whisper, "What if it happens here?" It never did. The Modoc had no intention of heading north. But fear doesn't need facts. It only needs fuel. And the Modoc War provided plenty. At the time, the Modoc Plateau to the north, the land that would cradle Fort Bidwell, had no military presence to speak of. It was too remote, too empty, too wild. But in 1865, Just as the Civil War ended and the West began to unravel, the US Army planted a flag in the dust. Fort Bidwell. Its founding wasn't just about protection, it was about projection, a statement to every tribe, settler, and outlaw that this land was now being watched, claimed, controlled. That any resistance, real or imagined, would be met not with negotiation, but with boots, bullets, and barbed wire. The site was chosen for its high vantage near the edge of 3 territories, California, Oregon, and Nevada, a place where native paths crossed settler roads, where rivers fed into dry basins, where a garrison, even a small one, could control the crossroads of migration and memory. The early days were chaos. The first structures were built under threat of frost. Soldiers, many of them recent veterans, arrived with wool uniforms better suited for Virginia than the high desert. Their tents collapsed under snow. Their mules died from alkali poisoning. Their supply trains got lost in canyon country and didn't return for weeks. Captain Alaric Granger, who took command that winter, wrote, "We have built more graves than cabins. The men suffer terribly. Morale is a word I dare not use. We are closer to the moon than to civilization." But the fort held. And with it came patrols. Scout teams dispatched to monitor native movements. Messengers sent to ranchers to offer, or demand, cooperation. Blacksmiths fashioned horseshoes while watching the horizon. Rifles were oiled every night, even when there were no targets. Because the Modoc had taught a lesson. And lessons, in the eyes of the army, had to be answered with posture. It wasn't just the army that responded. Settlers, emboldened by the growing presence of federal troops, pushed deeper into Paiute land. They built fences around sacred springs. They dug wells in hunting grounds. They carried shotguns to trading posts and looked every native in the eye as if daring them to speak. The Paiute, for their part, saw what was coming. They had watched the Modoc be hunted, hanged, and scattered. They knew that resistance, once provoked, would be crushed without mercy. So many chose silence. Others chose movement, drifting further east, deeper into the desert, to wait and see if the storm would pass. Some tried alliance. A few young men joined Army Scout teams, guiding soldiers across terrain their ancestors knew by heart. One such man, recorded only as Toby, was said to have saved a detachment from freezing death during a blizzard, guiding them to a hot spring buried beneath snow. But even that loyalty brought no protection. In 1874, a Paiute family was mistakenly shot by settlers near Cedar Pass, accused of horse theft without trial, without evidence. Their bodies were left unburied for days. The army launched an investigation. Nothing came of it. Trust, if it ever existed, was gone. Inside Fort Bidwell, the routine of military life continued. Bugle calls, inspections, the endless grind of boredom punctuated by brief flashes of terror, a gunshot in the night, hoofbeats too close to camp, a missing scout, and always the wind. It came screaming down from the mountains, howling through the garrison like a ghost, too angry to sleep. It ripped canvas from wagons. It carried sand into lungs. It howled through every crack in the stone walls, as if the land itself resented being contained. The fort expanded slowly. Barracks were reinforced. A hospital was built, a single room with a leaking roof. A telegraph line was installed, though it failed more often than it worked. Officers brought wives, then families. Children played under the shadow of the watchtower, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had once been a trail, now forgotten, now forbidden. Still, the fear lingered. No large battle ever came to Fort Bidwell. No siege, no rebellion. But the Modoc War had done its damage. It had drawn lines. It had reshaped minds. And in its wake, it left a frontier more guarded, more hardened, and more willing to trade diplomacy for discipline. Years later, an army chaplain assigned to the fort would write in his journal, "It is strange how a war that never came here still lives in every shadow. We patrol not to prevent violence, but to perform an idea that control is peace and peace is silence. But the land remembered differently. For the northern Paiute, for the Modoc survivors scattered to Oklahoma and beyond, for the spirits that drift across the ridges, silence was not peace. It was absence, the kind that comes when a voice is taken, not offered. Fort Bidwell stood because of a war that passed it by. But in the scars it left, the fear it seeded, that war changed everything. And for those who lived on the high desert, the gunfire from the south never really faded. It simply moved into the wind. The wind never stopped. It swept down from the Warner Mountains in long, keening waves, carrying with it grit, cold, and the eerie silence of a land that had seen too much and said too little. At Fort Bidwell, that wind clawed through every crack in the timber walls, filled every bootprint with dust, and wrapped itself around the bones of men who had signed up for duty and found themselves buried in solitude. Life behind the walls of Fort Bidwell wasn't glorious, it wasn't noble, it was survival, and not the kind sung about in war songs. There were no medals, no charges into gunfire, no grand flags snapping above victorious ranks. Here, survival came in smaller acts, fixing a broken stove with iron scraps, digging latrines into frozen earth, chopping wood until your hands bled, just to make sure your tent didn't become a coffin. The fort was remote, so far removed from the eastern cities that letters from Boston or Philadelphia could take weeks, sometimes months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Supply trains came seasonally, delayed by snow, bandits, or just sheer distance. And even when they came, they often brought little more than flour riddled with weevils, worm-rotted salt pork, and hardtack so dense it had to be soaked in coffee for hours to chew. There was no glamour in garrison life. The men were a mixed bunch, young recruits from eastern cities, still soft and blinking against the desert sun, Civil War veterans, haunted by battles behind them and half-mad from memories they couldn't shake, Irish immigrants, freedmen, drifters who had nowhere else to go. Some came for the pay, others for the promise of land after service, a few just to disappear. They lived in hand-built barracks, long, narrow structures chinked with mud and moss, their windows shuttered against wind and snow. In summer, the heat turned the interiors into ovens. In winter, breath froze before it hit the wall. Lieutenant Amos Kellogg, stationed at Bidwell in 1871, wrote in his journal, "We are not soldiers here, not really. We are custodians of silence. We march to fill time. We drill because we fear what stillness will reveal in our own heads." Outside the barracks, life was no kinder. Each day started before dawn with roll call and a thin ration of coffee, boiled black over embers and thick enough to chew. Then came labor. If supplies had run short, soldiers were ordered into the surrounding wilderness to hunt game or gather firewood. Axes were dull, rifles were worn. Traps were set with rawhide and wire, baited with dried apples or scraps of jerky. They hunted deer mostly, sometimes antelope. A lucky party might bring in a blacktail buck, enough to feed the post for 2 or 3 days. Unlucky ones returned cold, tired, and empty-handed. More than one man lost fingers to frostbite. A few didn't return at all, victims of the terrain or of something waiting in the brush that didn't appreciate their presence. For those on patrol duty, the risks were different. Mounted scouts rode out in pairs or alone across vast stretches of sage and stone, following reports of movement, checking for signs of Paiute camps, or simply showing the flag. They carried Springfield trapdoor carbines, upgrades from the old flintlocks, and rode with sabers that rarely left their scabbards. The guns were serviceable, but heavy, and in a sudden storm or a high-speed chase, they were often more burden than blessing. But these patrols weren't always confrontational. Many days passed in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather, the hiss of wind through grass, the distant call of a hawk. Men sometimes wrote about the loneliness more than the danger, the feeling of being utterly alone on the rim of a continent, watched by eyes they couldn't see, praying their horse wouldn't break a leg 20 miles from shelter. Inside the fort, bushcraft became necessity. The official supply chain couldn't be trusted, tools rusted, blankets tore. So the men improvised. They carved tent pegs from pine limbs, stitched saddle straps from rawhide, boiled tallow to waterproof boots. One corporal reportedly built a stove from a rusted barrel, a wagon wheel hub, and stones from a creek bed. An act of frontier ingenuity, born from frostbite and frustration. Water was drawn from shallow wells, sometimes brackish and filled with silt. When the water turned foul, and it often did, men boiled it with pine needles or added vinegar to kill the taste. Diarrhea and dysentery stalked the barracks like ghosts, so did lice. Laundry was done once a week, if at all, by soldiers assigned to punishment detail. Soap was rare. More often, uniforms were beaten clean in riverbeds with stones, then dried stiff on clotheslines strung between fence posts. There were few comforts. A battered fiddle might offer music in the evenings. A chessboard, hand-carved from elk bone and ash wood, passed from man to man. A Bible, a letter, a single photograph, dog-eared and thumb-stained, of a woman back east, or sometimes of no one at all. Evenings were long and cold. The men huddled around pot-bellied stoves, telling stories that grew taller with each telling. They gambled with buttons and carved dice. Some drank, despite prohibition. Rot-gut whiskey and gut-punch homemade spirits, brewed from corn mash or stolen vinegar, hidden in canteens and stashed in hay bales. Drunken fights were not uncommon. One ended with a soldier stabbed through the hand with a bayonet, his scream echoing across the frozen parade ground. Punishment was swift. Extra guard duty, latrine digging, solitary confinement in the dark root cellar beneath the mess hall, where rats kept better company than the cold stone walls. The fort maintained signal posts on the surrounding ridges, crude towers of stacked timber with lanterns and flags for semaphore. These were manned in shifts, always with 2 men, always armed. It wasn't just about communication. It was about surveillance, visibility, dominance. A constant reminder to any wandering band that the eyes of the army never closed. Yet still, the land resisted. Storms came down from the Sierras without warning, turning dry gullies into flash floods. Coyotes stole chickens. Cougars stalked the perimeter. Once, in 1873, a wildfire swept through the valley, ignited by a lightning strike on dry grass. It roared toward the fort like a living thing, and every able-bodied man was summoned to dig trenches and form bucket lines from the well. They fought the flames through the night. The eastern hay barn burned to the ground. 2 men were hospitalized with burns. The chickens roasted alive. And in the aftermath, a silence thicker than smoke settled over the post. Still, the fort endured. Because it had to. Because it was ordered to. Because no matter how brutal the isolation, the army's job was to hold, to mark the map with presence, to cast a shadow where no law yet reached. For some men, the months became years. Re-enlistment bought time, but robbed hope. A few married local women, a few deserted, a few simply disappeared. Years later, an old sergeant named Henry Rusk, long since retired, told a reporter, "It wasn't the fights that killed men at Bidwell. It was the quiet. It got into your head, made you forget who you were, made you remember things you didn't want to. That fort wasn't just stone. It was a cage. And yet, from that cage came order. A fragile, wavering order built not on glory, but on grit. They were soldiers garrisoned in isolation, caught between a war that had ended and a peace that never really came, surrounded not by battlefields, but by emptiness. And in that emptiness, they survived. One sunrise at a time, one firewood bundle, one trap set in the snow, one letter home that might never be read. They came not with swords or banners, but with shovels, children, and seed. While Fort Bidwell stood like a stone sentinel in the northern reaches of the California desert, its shadow began to draw a different kind of people. Not soldiers, not scouts, but settlers, men and women chasing land, freedom, or simply a second chance. This was not a march of conquest. It was a slow, grinding crawl. One wagon, one mule, one dust-covered family at a time. They came from Kansas, Missouri, even as far as Ohio, or Maine, carrying everything they owned in a creaking wagon bed no longer than a small bedroom. Tin pans rattled from the sides, a butter churn lashed to the back, and often a Bible or photograph tucked beneath a child's pillow, a memory of the place they left behind, or the one they hoped to find. But what they found in the high desert was not the promise they'd been sold. Here, the ground was bone dry for 9 months and frozen stiff for 3. The air burned in summer and cut like a knife in winter. Rain came rarely, snow came early, and between them was a wind that never stopped, stripping paint from wagons, cracking skin raw, howling through the eaves of every half-built cabin like a ghost that refused to leave. Still, they stayed. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered them 160 acres, so long as they could prove the land improved. That meant fencing, ploughing, and building. It meant staying through 5 years of hardship. For some, that patch of earth was the difference between starvation and salvation. Among them were people like the Anders family, farmers from southern Illinois who arrived in 1877 with 3 children and a team of oxen. In a letter preserved in a Nevada archive, Joseph Anders wrote, "We have found a spot near the creek where the soil seems softer, though the wind is cruel and the sky gives us little. Anna weeps some nights. The baby is sick with coughing, but I believe we are meant to stay. I built the first corner of the root cellar today, dug deep and lined with stone. A coyote took a hen. I fear we will lose more." Their first winter nearly killed them. Temperatures dropped below 0. The canvas roof of their lean-to collapsed under snow. The Anderses burned their wagon wheels for warmth and slaughtered one of their oxen when stores ran out. They survived by digging into the frozen earth, crafting an adobe shelter from clay and straw, sealing it with ash and animal fat to keep out the cold. That adobe, crude as it was, saved them. Other families tried sod, peeling thick mats of grass and earth from the plains and stacking them like bricks. They called them prairie castles, though the interiors were anything but regal. Walls wept mud when it rained. Insects nested in every crevice. The floors turned to soup during storms and froze like stone each night, but they endured. Soap was made from lye boiled with tallow, the fat skimmed from game or livestock, mixed in iron kettles and stirred with wooden paddles until it thickened. It burned the skin if mishandled, but it scrubbed away disease. Water had to be hauled from springs or shallow wells, often 2 miles or more away. Children, some no older than 6, walked that path daily, balancing buckets heavy enough to strain their shoulders, risking snakebite, sunstroke, or worse. If they spilled, they went back. Food came from what could be coaxed from the land or hunted beyond it. Jackrabbits, quail and deer, wild onions and bitterroot, pine nuts cracked open with stones roasted over coals, then mashed into cakes. Everything had to be stored, usually in dug-out root cellars, dark and cool, lined with branches and dried moss. Salt was gold, sugar a luxury, and coffee, when it came, was brewed 3 times from the same grounds. Still, the work never ended. Fences had to be built by hand, post by post, using whatever timber could be scavenged from distant ridges or bartered from passing traders. Ploughs, if they broke, had to be mended with hammered scrap or wooden braces. Nails were reused, rope was braided from rawhide, and every scrap of iron, horseshoe, hinge, hook, was worth more than its weight in coin. Homesteaders wrote of digging irrigation ditches with nothing but shovels, of patching clothing with thread made from sinew, of learning to read the sky like scripture. And always, there was the question of who else walked these lands. The northern Paiute were still there, watching, sometimes trading, sometimes warning. They appeared quietly at fence lines, at riverbanks, at the edge of firelight, faces expressionless, arms folded, eyes ancient and unblinking. They knew the land better than anyone. They knew what was coming. Some settlers welcomed them, others feared them, but all felt the tension. Mary Evans, whose diary was later donated to the Fort Bidwell Historical Society, recorded one such meeting. A man rode up to the homestead, dressed in elk hide and feathers, silent but not unkind. He gave no name. He pointed to our corn rows, then to the sky, then to the stream. Then he left. I believe he meant the water will not hold. And he was right. That summer, the stream dried to a trickle. The corn died. The Anderses lost a child to fever. The Evanses packed up and left. Dozens of others did the same. For every family that endured, 3 more vanished, driven out by weather, sickness, or the slow grinding erosion of hope. But those who stayed, who weathered 5 winters, then 6, slowly carved something permanent from the dust. A schoolhouse rose, 4 walls and a bell. A trading post followed, where hunters and soldiers exchanged pelts and flour and whiskey. Then a church, its rafters hauled from 60 miles away on mule-drawn sleds, its pews built from juniper. Life didn't get easier, but it got possible. By the 1880s, Fort Bidwell was no longer alone. It stood surrounded now by rough farms, crooked fences, and lives stubbornly planted into soil that had once resisted every footstep. But make no mistake, this was still a frontier, still fragile. One dry season could end it all. One failed hunt, one broken leg, one spark in a hayloft. There were no doctors, no telegraph lines that worked in winter, no laws that could reach beyond the fort's edge. Justice was swift and often final. Disputes were settled with fists, or with fire, or with silence. And through it all, the land watched. It had outlasted every tribe, every fort, every settler who thought they could tame it. And it would go on, long after Fort Bidwell fell silent, long after the Anders name disappeared from census records, long after the fences rusted into the earth. But in that brief flicker of time, in those years when the last push of settlement met the final breath of wilderness, something rare happened. Families, armed with little more than iron will and hand tools, wrote their names into a place that had never been willing to welcome them. They hunted, scraped, sowed, dug, and prayed. They lost children and planted crops in the same breath. They buried the past and chased a future that seemed always just out of reach. And for a moment, they endured. Against all odds. Against the wind. Against the silence. They endured. The land did not forget. Even as fences rose and cabins multiplied, even as the dust of wagon wheels masked the old trails, the Modoc Plateau still whispered in the language of its first stewards, the Northern Paiute. To outsiders, it was an empty landscape made useful by plows and patrols. But to those who had lived here for centuries, it was a living memory, wounded, yes, but not gone. The year was 1866, when the US government drew lines across ancestral land and called it a solution. The Fort Bidwell Indian Reservation was born from fear, policy, and calculation. It was meant to contain the Northern Paiute, to sever their seasonal migrations, to stamp a border on a people who had never needed one. It was not a gift, it was a cage. But the Paiute knew how to survive cages. They had survived worse. They had walked from burned-out winter camps to dusty, barren holding grounds more than once. They had seen promises inked in Washington vanish in the dry air of the desert. They knew that a treaty was often just another word for removal. That peace, in American hands, could mean the slow death of culture by silence. Still, they endured. Some went willingly to the reservation, coaxed by the hope of rations or medicine. Others came under pressure, with soldiers watching and settlers demanding safety. And some never came at all, choosing to vanish into the vastness of Nevada and Oregon, to live quietly in canyons, holding fast to their language and identity beneath the radar of a nation that only understood ownership. The Fort Bidwell Reservation sprawled across thousands of acres of high desert, creek beds, and sagebrush valleys. But its land was poor for farming, and the tools promised by Indian agents rarely arrived. The Paiute built what they could: brush shelters at first, then earth lodges dug into hillsides, lined with stone and sealed with pine pitch. Winters were brutal, summers unforgiving. But they adapted. They returned to the rhythms that had carried them for generations, harvesting pine nuts in the fall, digging camas roots in the tea, spring, setting traps for jackrabbits, and fishing hidden streams where the water still ran clean and cold. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival. Language was the first battleground. Missionaries and government teachers came with English primers and punishment. Paiute children were told to forget their words, to speak only the tongue of their conquerors. Those who resisted were beaten or starved. But at night, in secret, mothers whispered stories in northern Paiute, stories of coyote, of creator spirits, of rivers that remembered. Old women sang lullabies behind blankets. Elders carved stories into wood or painted them onto rawhide, passing memory into material. One woman, known only as Naivis, was said to have taught 10 children in a root cellar beneath her lodge. She used sticks and stones to write the old symbols and taught them to count in Paiute by the cadence of drumbeats. Her legacy lived not in books, but in voices that could still name the stars. Resistance didn't always wear feathers or carry weapons. Sometimes it looked like a grandmother refusing to stop singing, or a young man refusing to cut his hair, or a wedding ceremony held beneath a starlit sky, where old songs were sung despite the risk. But pressure mounted with each passing decade. In the 1870s, federal agents pushed assimilation harder. Boys were taken to boarding schools in distant states. Some never returned. Girls were trained as domestic servants, stripped of regalia, their hands made to serve households that had once feared them. These were not just children. They were targets. The next generation, scrubbed clean of what made them Paiute. Yet the Paiute adapted still. When horses were taken, they trapped more. When wild game grew scarce, they planted. When rations failed, they leaned on the knowledge passed down in bone memory: how to dry chokecherries, how to boil acorn mush, how to use rabbit brush for healing. They turned survival into ritual. Even their grief became sacred. At one funeral in the winter of 1883, mourners wrapped the deceased in rabbit-skin blankets and built a fire circle that burned for 3 days. Army officers called it pagan, but for the Paiute, it was the last mercy they could give, to guide a soul through a world that no longer resembled the one it had been born into. The 1880s brought more settlers, more fences, more laws. Grazing land shrank. Water sources were diverted. Paiute hunters were arrested for taking deer without permits they were never told how to get. Women were fined for gathering willow branches along the river. Ceremonial fires were outlawed under county regulations about open flame. Each act chipped away at a way of life older than the fort, older than the United States, but the people did not vanish. They worked as ranch hands, field workers, blacksmiths. Their skills, once used for survival, became labor sold cheap to the very families who had displaced them. Some carved bone jewelry and traded it for flour. Others tanned hides and sold them to traders. A few enlisted as scouts, leading military patrols through canyons their fathers had used to evade those same uniforms. By the 1890s, the reservation had its own school, its own church, and a scattering of frame houses built by government initiative. But not all Paiute lived there. Many chose to remain outside its boundaries, in makeshift villages on the edges of white settlements, walking a narrow line between visibility and resistance. They formed councils, quiet ones, hidden from view. They planned dances under full moons, masked as harvest feasts. They sang healing songs to sick children when doctors had nothing to offer but quinine and prayer. In 1898, a young man named To was arrested for refusing to send his daughter to the government school. In court, he said only one sentence before turning away. The white man gives schools to erase what he did not build. He spent 3 months in the Eureka jail. His daughter stayed with her grandmother, who taught her how to weave baskets tight enough to hold water. And still, the Paiute remained. They remained through epidemics, through crop failures, through the bitter winter of 1902 when the snow came chest-deep and 5 families had to share one fire pit just to make it through. They remained even when the census listed them as other or not at all. They remained in silence, in stories, in the stubborn refusal to be erased. By the turn of the century, the Fort Bidwell Reservation was still standing, not as a symbol of reconciliation, but as a witness to survival. Its boundaries had shifted, its residents had changed, but the people were still there. They walked the same trails their ancestors had once followed with cradle boards and sinew bows. They gathered sage in the same valleys. They still sang, even if only in whispers. In time, Fort Bidwell would fade. The soldiers would leave. The cannons would rust. The parade ground would become a field of weeds. But the Paiute story didn't end when the flags came down. It carried forward, in footsteps along a riverbed, in a child speaking a nearly lost word to her grandfather, in a prayer offered over a fire that burned not in defiance, but in remembrance. Because cultures do not die in war. They die when they are forgotten. And the Northern Paiute never forgot. Not the land, not the language, not the way back to themselves. Even as the world changed, they remained the heartbeat beneath the dust, the memory in the stone, the quiet resistance that refused to yield. They are still here, and the land still remembers. The frontier did not care for mistakes. A dull blade, a loose wagon wheel, or a spoiled sack of flour could mean the difference between endurance and death. At Fort Bidwell, every man, soldier or settler, learned this truth fast. And so, survival was not just about courage or muscle. It was about craft, resourcefulness, the kind of ingenuity that came not from books, but from blood and bone. The fort itself was never meant to be luxurious. Its construction was rushed, its resources limited. But within its boundaries was an unspoken code. If it breaks, fix it. If it's gone, make it. If you don't know how, learn fast, or suffer. Blacksmiths were the unheralded heroes of the post. Every few days, the clang of hammer on iron rang out across the compound, echoing through the valley like a battle drum. The forge was built from stone and clay, fed by charcoal made on site. Tools were repaired and repurposed, spades reforged from broken sabres, rifle parts hammered into hinges, wagon axles braced with horseshoe scraps. Corporal Elijah Baines, a smith turned soldier, once wrote in a letter, "We don't throw anything away out here. If it's metal, it has a second life. If it's wood, a third." He fashioned a makeshift pulley system from old stirrups, built a field plough using abandoned cannon wheels, and even repaired a ruptured stovepipe with flattened tin cups. But even outside the forge, bushcraft ruled. Draw knives carved everything from rifle stocks to furniture legs. Flint strikers were a staple. No one left the post without one. Striking steel against flint became a rhythm of survival, often done with gloved hands in howling wind or sleet. Fire was life, and flint was its spark. Soldiers practiced in darkness, blindfolded, learning to start a fire by feel, not by sight. Trail rations were more chemistry than cuisine. Salted pork, hardtack and beans were the staples, but when those ran dry, soldiers turned to pemmican, a dense mix of dried meat, rendered fat, and wild berries. Made in large batches, it could keep for months and was packed into leather pouches for long patrols. Some added a touch of wild mint or juniper to cut the grease and mask the flavour. Others chewed it raw, teeth grinding through sinew like saws through oak. Wagon repair was a survival art in itself. The roads, if they could be called that, chewed through wheel rims and splintered spokes like tinder. Every patrol returned with damage. Leather lashings were soaked, twisted, and used to bind axles. Sap from piñon trees was heated and used as an adhesive, sealing cracks in wood. Grease was rendered from animal fat and stored in tin cans, ladled into axle hubs to prevent seizure. When even these measures failed, the men turned to their surroundings. A grove of mountain mahogany near the ridgeline became a lifeline. Its wood, though slow to cut, was strong and flexible, perfect for patching, binding, or bracing. Soldiers kept wedges in their satchels to split it clean, and carried rope made from twisted yucca fibers, strong, coarse, and scratchy against the skin, but reliable under tension. Water purification was learned the hard way. Streams carried silt, disease, and worse. The fort's men used sand filters, made from stacked buckets filled with charcoal, gravel, and cloth. Others boiled water with coals and covered it with muslin. When that failed, they burned willow bark and mixed the ash into their canteens, a bitter drink, but one that settled stomachs more often than not. Medicine was improvisation. The fort doctor, if present, often worked with less than he needed. No morphine, no antiseptic, no refrigeration. So he turned to willow bark for pain, wild yarrow to staunch bleeding, and pine resin as an antiseptic salve. Burned fingers were coated in beeswax and lard. Coughs were treated with boiled sage, mixed with honey if any could be found. There was a soldier named Danvers, who caught a fever after falling into the icy creek during a supply run. The doctor had no quinine, so he packed the man in hot sand, applied heated stones to his feet, and fed him a mix of bearberry and mint. The fever broke after 3 days. Danvers never forgot. He later built a still from a copper kettle and brewed his own herbal tonics, soldier, healer, and apothecary rolled into one. Latrine duty was a daily reminder that even the unglamorous could be deadly. Waste was buried deep, trenches dug and covered with lime, when available, or hot ash from the forge. Flies were a constant enemy. Each summer, the fort reeked of ammonia and sweat, and disease hung in the air like smoke. To combat it, the soldiers built wind-driven fans out of broken shutters and scrap canvas, rigged to spin in the constant desert breeze. These crude ventilators helped push foul air away from the living quarters. Buckets of vinegar were kept near doorways, and mint was scattered on floors to suppress the stench. But perhaps the most overlooked tools were not forged from iron or cut from wood. They were sewn by hand. Moccasins were a prized possession, even among non-natives. Made from elk hide or soft deer leather, stitched with sinew and smoked for durability, they were silent, flexible, and far more comfortable than army-issued boots. Soldiers often traded tobacco or jerky with the Paiute for a pair. Some learned to make their own. One veteran of Fort Bidwell once claimed, "You walk 20 miles in boots, you curse your luck. You walk 20 in moccasins, you whisper thanks." Clothing, too, was modified with care. Fringes were not decoration, they shed water and repelled insects. Oilskin cloaks were made by soaking canvas in boiled linseed oil, a slow and dangerous process that sometimes left the maker half-choked on fumes. But the result? A weatherproof garment that could survive a snow squall or a desert storm. Even snowshoes were fashioned from scratch. Bent willow frames, laced with rawhide strips, allowed scouts to glide across deep drifts without sinking. The design came from the local tribes, adopted not out of curiosity but necessity. Every man who served at Fort Bidwell, every woman who settled nearby, carried the same unspoken burden: make do, or make do without. It was not a life of comfort, but it was a life carved from skill, knowledge passed hand to hand, tricks learned from mistake, patterns etched into muscle memory like maps on a hide. They did not have factories. They had pocket knives. They did not have hospitals. They had boiled herbs and hope. They did not have armies of support. They had each other and the will to keep going. And somehow, that was enough. Enough to build a fort from raw timber. Enough to defend a post through winter siege. Enough to plough and plant and patch and pull together what was broken. The men and women of Fort Bidwell were not just pioneers of place, they were pioneers of method. Their lives became a blueprint of adaptation. One fire start, one wagon brace, one hand-sewn boot at a time. Their tools were humble, their supplies were meager, but what they built from them was nothing short of survival itself. The frontier was not just a man's crucible, it was a woman's battleground too, silent, grueling, and often without recognition. At Fort Bidwell, where the wind never stopped screaming through the high desert sage, it was the women, unwritten in official reports, absent from maps, who held the line between endurance and collapse. They arrived in wagons beside their husbands, faces chapped from dust, cradling infants wrapped in quilts stitched with the names of dead relatives. They walked behind oxen on blistered feet. They built fires before dawn and slept last beneath roofs still leaking from last week's storm. Some had volunteered for this life, chasing dreams of land and liberty. Most did not. For settler wives like Martha Jennings, a Missouri woman who settled near Fort Bidwell in 1873, survival meant far more than food and shelter. It meant birthing her first child alone in a sod cabin during a snowstorm, while her husband rode 2 days to fetch a midwife who never arrived. Martha cut the cord herself with a fishing knife. Her daughter lived. She did not write about the pain, but in her journal, still housed in the Modoc County Archive, she noted simply, "Born in blood and fire. The wind never stopped. I could not tell if I screamed or if it was just the wind." That wind defined everything. It whipped the smoke sideways from cook fires, rattled the boards of half-built cabins, and dried laundry stiff on lines strung between fence posts. The women learned to work with it, not against it. They baked bread with stones in the corners of the oven to hold in heat. They packed mud between floorboards to keep out scorpions. They lined blankets with rabbit fur to stop frostbite from reaching their children's toes. Their medicine was made from memory. Wild yarrow to stop bleeding, elderberry syrup for fever, crushed plantain leaves for stings. Many learned these remedies from Paiute women, who had long known what the land could give and what it could take away. The relationships were delicate, sometimes warm, sometimes tense, but always marked by an unspoken recognition. Women survived through each other when no one else would help. Inside the fort's walls, military laundresses worked sunup to sundown, washing the sweat-soaked wool of uniforms with lye soap and river water so cold it cracked their hands open. Each woman was assigned to a company, paid in rations, rarely in coin. Their quarters were damp, their work endless, their voices rarely heard beyond the clatter of washtubs and the rasp of scrub brushes. But these women were often the backbone of morale. They mended torn trousers, delivered hot broth to the infirmary, and sometimes, quietly, passed letters between soldiers and their sweethearts in town, or buried trinkets sent from home in their aprons, waiting for the right moment to deliver a smile. One such laundress, Nellie Bright, was known as the Ghost in Grey because she wore a second-hand Confederate dress long after the war had ended. She had lost her brothers at Gettysburg, lost her husband to fever on the march west. But at Fort Bidwell, she earned the respect of hard men who'd never cried over anything but her stew, and the songs she sang while scrubbing blood from tunics after skirmishes in the hills. She never remarried. She had no children. But every young recruit called her Aunt Nellie, and she saw more death than most generals. Then there were the school teachers. Few were sent, and fewer stayed. One of them, Eliza Harmon, came from Boston in 1880, bringing with her a trunk full of books and a spine made of iron. She taught in a one-room building, shared with Sunday sermons and town meetings. Her students were Paiute children, settler orphans, and soldiers' sons, all crammed onto benches made from split logs. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also hygiene, sewing, and the basics of medicine. She walked 2 miles each morning from her boarding house, past cattle yards and drying hides, through frost and heat, and never once missed a day, even when her shoes split and she had to tie them with twine. In her journal, she wrote, "There is a quiet war here, not with guns, but with ignorance and grief. I fight it with chalk and song." Some women lived between worlds, Paiute wives of enlisted men, or widows who remained after raids and relocations, straddled the fault line between two civilizations. They carried the customs of their mothers, while navigating the expectations of a society that often saw them as neither one thing nor the other. They brought children into both cultures. They taught how to strip sinew for thread, how to dry fish on willows, how to stitch moccasins that could walk 100 miles. They buried their ancestors one day and attended government church the next. Their lives were a daily act of translation, compromise, and survival, bridges between stories no one else wanted to hear. And when disease came, as it always did, measles, influenza, typhoid, it was the women who became the walls holding families upright. They boiled linens, they burned mattresses, they poured vinegar into basins and forced broth down reluctant throats. They buried infants in snow-covered plots behind the fort, pressing crosses from twigs and reciting prayers no priest ever heard. They did not cry for long. There was too much work to do. Through all of it, there was an invisible ledger that no officer's journal recorded. The thousands of meals cooked, wounds stitched, wood split, socks darned, babies rocked, and stories whispered into the dark when the lanterns were low and the wolves howled too close to the windows. The women of Fort Bidwell did not ride into battle. They did not sign treaties. They were not given medals or commands. But they were the pulse beneath the rifle, the breath behind the homestead, the reason any of it endured. Without them, there would have been no fort, no legacy, no stories to tell. And though history has often failed to write their names, the wind still remembers. The rooms they warmed, the paths they wore, the songs they sang. They were more than survivors. They were the spine of a civilization stitched from hardship, loss, and the fierce refusal to be forgotten. By the time the sun set on Fort Bidwell's military chapter, its flag still fluttered in the wind, but the meaning had changed. It was no longer the outpost of war it had once been, no longer the shield of settlers or symbol of federal force. By the late 1880s, the Army's footsteps had grown fainter. Drills were fewer, patrols thinned. The bugles still called revel in the morning, but its echo didn't bounce off ranks of marching men. It drifted out over a growing town, where chickens clucked in backyards and children played in alleys that once echoed with the tread of cavalry boots. Fort Bidwell was changing. The wars were ending, or at least moving further west. The Modoc had been subdued. The Paiute were now bound by reservation lines, their resistance worn thin by attrition, bureaucracy, and time. What remained was not peace exactly, but exhaustion. And into that silence, the rhythm of civilian life began to seep in. The buildings came first. Not new ones, but old structures repurposed with care and desperation. The officers' barracks, once lined with maps and ammunition, were cleared and cleaned. One became a schoolhouse, another a dry goods store. The blacksmith's forge remained, but now it served more plows than pistols. Horses were still shod, but they were farm animals now, not war mounts. In 1890, the fort's stable was converted into a livery. The mess hall, with its scorched beams and soot-stained rafters, was transformed into a general store. Sacks of flour replaced crates of rifle cartridges. Shelves once stocked with powder and shot now held coffee beans, sugar cones, and bolts of gingham. The register was a repurposed ammunition chest. The bell hung from a salvaged stirrup. A man named Luther Henson, a discharged sergeant who had served 10 years at the fort, was one of the first to settle permanently. He married a local widow, took over a parcel of land just north of the creek, and opened a small post office from his parlour. He kept the mail in locked footlockers, sorted on an old army cot. Twice a month, he rode his mule 30 miles to the rail junction to collect packages and letters, returning with news from a country that was growing faster than anyone in Bidwell could imagine. It wasn't easy. Nothing in Bidwell ever was. Winters still clawed at doors. Water lines froze. Firewood ran out. Spring brought floods. Summer brought drought. And autumn was one long scramble to prepare for the cold. But there was something new now, a sense of continuity, not just survival, permanence. Families planted orchards. Wells were dug deeper. A grist mill was built from the bones of the old armory. The church opened its doors with a congregation of 10, half of them former soldiers, the rest local ranchers and Paiute converts, who sang hymns in a mix of English and their native tongue. Children born in the shadow of the old fort grew up knowing more about sowing seeds than firing muskets. They climbed trees planted where sentry towers once stood. They carved initials into schoolhouse desks that had once held field maps. Their lullabies were no longer drowned out by marching drums, but by crickets and coyotes, and the soft murmurs of parents who dared to hope they might stay for good. Not everyone made the transition. Some soldiers, unable to adapt to civilian life, vanished into the mountains. They drifted west into California's gold fields, or north toward Oregon's timber camps. Some turned to drink, others to solitude. One was found years later living in a cabin near the Oregon border, still wearing his cavalry coat, still polishing his Springfield rifle with a reverence no one could quite understand. He hadn't fired it in 10 years, but he kept it ready, just in case. Others stayed, but changed, like Corporal Amos Brandt, who became the town's first unofficial constable, armed not with a saber but a stern voice and a knack for breaking up fights outside the tavern before they got serious. He walked with a limp from a wound taken in 1878, but he could still split firewood faster than most men half his age. He died in 1903, splitting a log behind the general store. Locals said he had a smile on his face when he fell. Even the fort's cemetery changed. Once the resting place of soldiers and a few civilians, it grew to include ranchers, women, children, even Paiute elders, buried under crosses made from juniper. The lines between enemy and neighbor blurred in death, as they so often did in life. The stories of those who stayed lingered in every corner. The child born in a tent behind the infirmary, who became the town's first school teacher. The laundress who opened a boarding house and taught herbal medicine to local girls. The Paiute boy who had once hidden from soldiers in the hills, now selling pelts and dried herbs in the weekly market. The town of Fort Bidwell became a palimpsest, layer upon layer of stories, hardship and hope, each one written atop the last, never fully erasing what came before. And yet, traces of the old fort remained. You could still see the outlines of the parade ground, where officers once barked commands. The old flagpole stood crooked but unbowed, the wind whipping past it just the same as it had in 1865. Some mornings, veterans would gather there, silent, heads bare, remembering friends who never left. The community they helped shape was no utopia. Tensions lingered. Poverty remained. But there was resilience here. A quiet, stubborn belief that this place, carved from dust and conflict, could become something lasting. In 1897, a travelling photographer passed through Bidwell and captured a picture of Main Street. In it, a soldier's uniform hangs in a shop window. A Paiute woman walks beside a white settler, both carrying baskets of apples. A child plays with a hoop near a watering trough. The mountains loom in the distance, unchanged and eternal. That photo still exists, faded, but clear enough. It tells the truth better than any document or dispatch. The fort had fallen quiet, but in its place, a town had risen, pieced together by calloused hands, stubborn hearts, and the slow, patient work of turning a war-torn outpost into home. The wind still moves across the Modoc Plateau like it always has, slow, wide, and full of memory. It whispers through the rabbit brush, rattles the old fort's crumbling foundations, and carries with it stories that refuse to be buried. For many, Fort Bidwell is a chapter closed, a military outpost retired, its soldiers long gone, its barracks converted or collapsed. But for others, The story didn't end when the uniforms vanished. It only changed form. To the northern Paiute, this land was never a fort. It was never a post. It was home. And though the 20th century brought new names, new borders, and new wounds, it did not erase that truth. At the dawn of that new century, the Fort Bidwell Indian community remained. Reduced in numbers, confined to reservation lines, but still rooted in soil, their ancestors had walked long before the first cavalry wagon creaked into view. What came next was not the quiet of peace, but the long silence of policy. The slow grinding wheel of government programs, land allotments, and efforts to mold native lives into someone else's image. In the early 1900s, federal agents arrived again, but this time, not with rifles, but paperwork. The Dawes Act had been passed a decade earlier, dividing communally held tribal lands into individual plots. Those who accepted them were given US citizenship. Those who didn't were left with less than before. The intent, officials claimed, was to civilize native people, to make them farmers, homeowners, Christians. But what it did was carve the land into pieces, leaving behind confusion, debt, and the beginning of a new kind of displacement. Then came the schools. Children from Fort Bidwell and other reservations were taken, sometimes with consent, often without, and placed in government-run boarding schools. Dozens of miles away. Sometimes hundreds. One former student, Anna Lou James, remembered waking up in a dormitory in Riverside, California, unable to speak English and forbidden to speak Paiute. She was 7. "They cut my hair," she would recall years later. "They burned my clothes. They made me scrub my skin like it was wrong. I stopped dreaming for a while." These schools stripped away more than language. They stripped stories, ceremonies, names. Children were renamed Tom, Mary, James, given Bible verses in place of beadwork, and trained for labor, domestic work, farm work, industrial trades. But even in those rigid walls, the old ways endured. Beneath blankets at night, girls whispered Paiute words to one another. Boys carved symbols into bedposts, small patterns only their grandmothers would recognize. Elders sent cedar bark sewn into pockets or tobacco wrapped in cloth. In resistance, there was survival. In survival, the seeds of resurgence. The Great Depression nearly broke what remained. Jobs were scarce, rations scarce still. Fort Bidwell became more isolated than ever, left behind by industry, ignored by government. Yet the people adapted again. They raised chickens, grew beans, gathered roots and berries. They sold baskets to passing motorists. They mended clothes 3 times before replacing them. Pride did not fill their plates, but it held their families together. In 1934, a faint glimmer returned. The Indian Reorganization Act, pushed through by President Franklin Roosevelt's administration, allowed native communities to form tribal governments, officially recognized, legally empowered, and better equipped to manage their own affairs. For Fort Bidwell, this was a shift long overdue. The Fort Bidwell Indian community reorganized in the years that followed, drafting their constitution, electing leaders, and slowly reclaiming a measure of self-determination. But it was never easy. Federal funding was inconsistent. Health services remained distant. Education lacked cultural relevance. And always, there was the weight of memory, of broken promises, and ancestors buried beneath sagebrush fields that now bore government fencing. Still, the people endured. Elders taught the language in kitchens and porches, even when no formal classes were offered. Ceremonies returned, quietly at first, then proudly. Children danced again at seasonal gatherings. Stories were told in circles beneath the stars, their cadence familiar and fierce. Every generation found its own way back. One man, Thomas Spotted, Elk, served in the US Army during World War II. He came home in uniform, medals pinned to his chest, and spoke his language before English when he stepped back onto Paiute land. In the 1960s, he helped organize a community garden behind the former officers' barracks, using irrigation ditches built by his grandfather. When asked once what he fought for, he answered, "For this, for us, for our own name." The old fort became a backdrop, its wooden bones greying but still upright. In time, some buildings were restored, others were left to collapse, reclaimed by earth and time. But to the community, these were not ruins, they were reminders. Today, the Fort Bidwell Indian community continues, not as a relic of conquest, but as a living homeland, a place where tribal leaders advocate for housing and education, where youth programs teach both coding and language, where the land, still rugged and dry, is treated not as property, but kin. The cemetery remains at the edge of town. Some headstones carry military ranks, others only hand-carved names. A few are unmarked, but their memory is kept in the stories, passed from grandmother to child. One such story tells of a woman named Asha, who walked barefoot through snow each winter to leave pine boughs on the graves of those who could no longer remember their own language. She said the trees would remember for them, and maybe they do, because here, amid the wind and the basalt cliffs and the whispering sage, the story of Fort Bidwell is not over. It is not just a tale of soldiers and settlers. It is the voice of a people who refused to vanish, who turned each attempt at erasure into a reason to remain. Echoes still rise from the reservation, not just of hardship, but of strength. Not just loss, but legacy. And if you listen closely, carried on the evening wind, you might still hear them. Not ghosts, but ancestors, speaking, teaching, enduring. When the sun dips low behind the Warner Mountains, Fort Bidwell casts a longer shadow than its size would ever suggest. Its bones still lie scattered across the high desert, aged timbers warped by time, stone chimneys standing alone like forgotten sentinels, and trails once carved by boots and wagon wheels now softened under dust and wild sage. What remains is not simply history, it's residue, a presence. The air feels thicker here, as if the past hasn't left, only settled deeper into the ground. You can still walk the parade ground, though the grass has swallowed its edges. The earth is pocked with old post holes and iron nails rusting in place, proof that order once ruled here, that soldiers once stood in line, rifles shouldered, eyes scanning a horizon that offered no comfort. Now, silence rules. And in that silence, something lingers. Locals call them ghosts, not always in the spectral sense, but in the way the land holds memory. They tell of footsteps heard in the night near the old infirmary foundation, or the creak of leather harnesses from the abandoned stables during windless evenings. Some speak of a woman in grey who walks the perimeter of the fort just before snow falls, her footprints vanishing before they're fully formed. But beneath the folklore is something more tangible. The stories etched in ruins, in grave markers barely legible, in tools uncovered by rain and time. These are the echoes of survival. Near the collapsed remains of the officers' quarters, buried beneath layers of wind-blown soil, someone once unearthed a broken draw knife, the blade still sharp, its handle worn smooth by calloused hands. Beside it, a tin mess plate riddled with corrosion and a comb with half its teeth intact. Each of these was once ordinary. Now they speak louder than any diary. Further down the trail toward the creek, you'll find remnants of the smokehouse, its stones blackened, still fragrant with a hint of ash when warmed by the summer sun. There, soldiers and settlers once dried venison and salted fish, their breath rising in fogged plumes above hickory fires. Today, the scent is faint, but it's there, like a fingerprint left behind by hard lives. Old graveyards mark the edge of the settlement, like a closing sentence. Headstones lean at uncertain angles. Some bear names carved by practiced hands. Others are only marked by stacked rocks or weathered wood. Many are nameless now. The wind has taken the words, but the dead are not forgotten. Among them lies Private Jonathan Elwell, who died in 1869 from pneumonia during a winter said to be so cold that ink froze in inkwells before it hit the page. His gravestone reads only, "Faithful to the end." Next to him, a child, Martha Briggs, age 2. No cause is listed, only the date, July 17th, 1874, the middle of drought season, likely a fever, possibly a snakebite. The frontier rarely offered clarity in death. There are stories here, too, that never made it to paper. Stories of a Paiute scout named Otuhu who guided a unit of soldiers through a blizzard in 1877, saving their lives. He was never mentioned in official records, but his descendants still walk the land, passing the tale like fire in the cold. Stories of a woman who lit a lantern every night for 15 years after her husband vanished during a hunting trip, convinced he would find his way home by its glow. And stories whispered of a boy, nameless, found sitting cross-legged beneath a juniper tree days after the rest of his wagon party had perished, alive, silent, clutching a tin soldier and a rabbit's foot. Not all ghosts wear chains. Some just never left. Inside what remains of the guardhouse, etched into a timber beam, are tally marks. Dozens, maybe hundreds. A soldier marking time, counting down the days of a deployment that must have felt eternal. Near the corner, someone carved a word. Enough. No one knows who wrote it, but everyone understands. The fort demanded more than obedience. It demanded pieces of the soul. And yet even now the land speaks of endurance. Juniper still grows through the collapsed bunkhouse. Wildflowers bloom near the powder magazine. Cottonwood trees have rooted in what was once the commandant's garden. The land forgets nothing, but it forgives slowly, reclaiming what was built on its back, smoothing over violence with time, but never fully erasing it. Hikers sometimes find rusted horseshoes, hammerheads, glass buttons. Some keep them. Others leave them in small cairns near the trail, gifts to the spirits or to history itself. A silent acknowledgement. We remember. Bushcrafters and survivalists who walk these paths today often pause in reverence. This is more than a historical site. It is a masterclass in human adaptation. Here, men and women harvested pine nuts, shaped stone into weapons, made tallow candles from bone, and fire-starting kits from flint and dry moss. Here, necessity was the mother of invention, and invention often meant the difference between life and death. Some say if you kneel close enough to the earth near the old rifle range, you can still find lead shot buried in the dirt, warmed by a sun that never left the 1800s behind. Others come just to listen. At dusk, when the coyotes sing low and the wind rustles dry grass like footsteps, it's easy to feel the weight of what once was. This was no simple place. It was a crucible, a collision point, where two worlds met, clashed, and scarred each other deeply. But Fort Bidwell endures, not because of the buildings or the names in stone, but because the land still remembers the people who walked it. Every broken blade, every scorched beam, every carved name. These are not artifacts. They are anchors. And in the quiet that follows a storm, in the golden light of late afternoon, when the mountains glow and the air holds still, the past feels close enough to touch. Not gone, just waiting to be heard. In the fading light of the high desert, where the Warner Mountains stand like ancient sentinels, and wind moves like memory across the Modoc Plateau, Fort Bidwell endures, not as a fortress of stone, but as a story written into the land. Here, the past doesn't sit behind velvet ropes or glass cases. It rises from the earth with every gust of dust, every footprint left by a deer, every rusted nail turned over by the curious hand of a child. Fort Bidwell may not draw tourists in droves or appear in history textbooks beside Gettysburg or Lexington, but its legacy is no less profound. Because here, in this forgotten corner of Northern California, the full weight of the American experiment once bore down on a few square miles of dry, stubborn land. And what remains is not ruin, but lesson. Fort Bidwell teaches us what it meant to live on the edge, not metaphorically, but literally. This was the outermost thread of the 19th century American frontier, stretched thin by ambition, conflict, and the cold calculus of expansion. It was here that soldiers stood in the bitter wind, not knowing if tomorrow would bring war, silence, or the slow ache of monotony. It was here that native families, the northern Paiute among them, were asked to give up not just land, but language, rhythm, and time. The fort teaches us that survival was not heroic. It was daily, painful, repetitive. Men repaired boots with twisted sinew and bent needles. Women gave birth in drafty cabins with herbs and hope and not much more. Children played beside graveyards, learning early that even laughter had limits. The tools were crude, the meals humble, and the comforts sparse. But through it all, people found ways to endure. What was carved from this place wasn't just roads or outposts. It was a kind of human resilience that still resonates. The kind that teaches you to watch the sky for weather signs, to measure each season not by calendar, but by the feel of bark, the ripeness of berries, the call of birds overhead. This land demanded you listen to it. Those who didn't, died. And then there is the other story, the harder one, the one still whispered, even now. Fort Bidwell was a garrison of survival for some, and a gate of loss for others. For the northern Paiute, this was not just another chapter, it was a wound. The reservation carved from their ancestral homeland was both sanctuary and cage. The schoolhouses taught obedience before they taught literacy. The treaties promised bread and offered betrayal. And yet, the culture persisted. That too is part of Fort Bidwell's legacy. Cultural resistance in the quiet moments, in a grandmother's lullaby sung in a banned language, in a basket woven with symbols older than maps, in a dance stepped out in dust where soldiers once drilled. Fort Bidwell teaches us that history isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a pot of beans simmering over mesquite fire. Sometimes it's the silence of a man folding his old uniform away. Sometimes it's a child learning the difference between gathering pine nuts for ceremony and gathering them for hunger. The fort reminds us that American history is not just one narrative, but many, tangled and unfinished. Soldiers and scouts, homesteaders and mothers, teachers and traders, elders and orphans. All of them trying to make sense of a land that was harsh, holy, and wholly indifferent to their plans. And in remembering them, we are reminded of ourselves. Because even now, Fort Bidwell speaks. It speaks through the cracked adobe walls of a schoolhouse turned tribal hall, through the rusted stovepipes that once heated cabins now buried in brush, through the creak of old floorboards in buildings that somehow still stand, even as time tries to push them down. It speaks in modern voices too, young leaders from the Fort Bidwell Indian community who carry forward tribal governance, language classes, land stewardship. They wear jeans and boots, carry smartphones and ceremonial staffs, speak English and Paiute in the same breath. They are not relics, they are reminders. Reminders that memory is not a burden, but a seed. And maybe that's what this place teaches best, that memory, when planted with care, can root deeper than violence, grow taller than erasure, and bloom even in rocky soil. Fort Bidwell is not just the site of what once was. It is a living challenge, a place that asks us to look again at the stories we forget, to question who got to build, who was asked to surrender, and who found ways to survive in spite of both. In the end, this isn't a monument to triumph. It's a monument to complexity, to grit, to the long, quiet kind of strength that does not win medals or carve names in marble, but carries children through famine, and elders through exile, and families through winters that would make lesser hearts falter. And so, as the sun slips behind the mountains and shadows stretch long across the brush, Fort Bidwell doesn't vanish. It hums beneath your feet. It moves in the trees. It waits in the silence between sentences. It endures, not because it was great, but because it was real. Because here, amid wind and stone and fire and snow, people tried. Some succeeded. Some failed. All mattered. And that, above all else, is what Fort Bidwell still teaches us. In the southeast corner of Maryland's eastern shore, where roads turn to dirt and cell signals vanish into silence, there is a forest unlike any other. It breathes slowly, listens closely, and when the mist rises, it whispers, not in words, but in the rustle of leaves, the creak of old limbs, and the distant groan of things that once were. They call it the Pocomoke. It's a name born from Algonquin roots, often said to mean dark water, though like everything else here, the truth is far murkier. The Pocomoke River slices through the forest like a black ribbon, stained not by pollution, but by tannins, the natural dyes of fallen cypress needles leached into the current over centuries. It is dark, still, and reflective. So dark, in fact, that at midday it looks like dusk. And in the depth of night, even the moon hesitates to shine here. To the outsider, it feels untouched, forgotten by time. But to those who've lived near it, worked in it, or feared it, the forest is very much alive. Its canopy chokes out the sun. Spanish moss hangs low like veils of the dead. The air is humid and close, thick with rot, pine, and something older, something primal. This is not a forest that welcomes. This is a forest that tests. Long before campfire ghost stories were passed down to children, before local legends painted the trees with spectres and witches, this land was the crucible for survival. Before it became haunted, it was hunting ground. Before it became eerie, it was home. The first to tread here without fear were the Pocomoke people, Native Americans whose lives intertwined with the forest in ways modern minds can scarcely imagine. They moved silently along cypress-lined trails, their feet wrapped in deer-hide moccasins that left no mark. Their canoes, carved from single tree trunks, slid across the black water like spirits, no compass, no maps, only the stars, the wind, and the feel of the river's pull. To survive here required more than strength. It required knowledge, intimacy with nature, trust in the unseen. They knew the secrets of the trees, which bark soothed pain, which fungus warned of sickness, which roots nourished the body when game ran lean. They set fish traps woven from river reeds, baited with instinct and patience. They spoke to the forest not in words, but in gestures, leaving stone markers and animal bones at the base of certain trees to show gratitude or ask forgiveness. To walk into this forest without respect was to vanish. The Pocomoke was never forgiving. Centuries later, when European settlers began pushing eastward, they did not understand the rules. They came with steel tools, thick boots, and heavy muskets, and yet they feared the forest in ways no native had. They spoke of getting turned around in daylight, of hearing voices where no one stood, of stepping onto what they thought was solid ground, only to sink waist deep into cold black muck. Horses refused to enter certain paths. Lamps refused to stay lit, and always the silence. Heavy, constant, pressing down. Even hardened frontiersmen would not camp within the cypress swamps. Too many had gone missing. Too many bodies had been found days later, faces frozen in terror, limbs twisted in impossible angles, their rifles still loaded. But fear didn't stop the settlers. The land was rich with timber, tall, straight cypress trees that could be sold downriver for boats and shingles. And land was land, no matter how cursed it felt. Axes rang through the trees like war cries. Fires were lit to clear brush. Cabins rose from the mud like bones forced from the earth. They brought their families, their livestock, their ambitions. But for every foot they gained, the forest took something in return. The black water swallowed wagons. Disease bloomed in the lungs from the damp, mosquito-thick air. Infants died. Crops rotted. The forest didn't need to fight with teeth. It had time. It had patience. And yet, some remained. the ones who learned to listen, the ones who heard the whispers. There are journals, fragments found in rotting trunks and local archives, that speak of this place with equal parts awe and dread. A man named Elias Thorne, a fur trapper who lived alone near the river's bend in 1763, wrote, "Each night, the trees speak to one another in voices not made for man. They creak, groan, knock, but they do not fall. I leave offerings now, pieces of bread, tanned rabbit hide. The forest seems pleased." He vanished that winter. No sign of struggle, no blood. Just his empty cabin, his boots by the door, and his traps set, untouched. The story of Pocomoke is not linear. It does not follow kings or wars. It follows the river's course, winding, hidden, and sometimes doubling back on itself. History here is written not in ink, but in tree rings, arrowheads, sunken boats, and bones left unburied beneath the moss. And so the forest remains. Stretching some 15 miles across, its heart still dense and uncharted. A place where GPS signals fail, where the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to return. But return is not always the goal. For some, entering the Pocomoke is a rite, a reckoning, an echo of all who came before, who hunted, starved, carved, prayed, bled, and disappeared. Some say the whispers are nothing more than wind or wildlife. Others aren't so sure. On still nights, if you stand at the river's edge and hold your breath, you may hear it too. The soft murmur between trees, the quiet lapping of water against roots, the distant knock of something old and slow. The forest does not speak to everyone, but when it does, it remembers everything. Pocomoke is not a story of ghosts. It is a story of survival, of land that resisted taming, of people who adapted or perished. It is not just a setting, but a living character, one with memory, one with hunger, and one that watches. The forest has always whispered. It's only now that we've begun to listen. Before the timbermen came with saws and wagons, before the missionaries carved crosses into trees and renamed rivers in foreign tongues, there were those who lived here in quiet harmony, children of the black water, the Pocomoke people. They did not own the land, they belonged to it. For thousands of years, long before history kept records, they moved with the seasons through the tangled arms of the forest. Their feet traced deer paths worn into the moss. Their minds knew every bend of the river, every changing song of the wind, every whisper from the reeds. To the Pocomoke, the forest was not wilderness. It was family. The dark river that winds through this land wasn't feared. It was sacred. Its slow black current, dyed by centuries of fallen cypress and cedar, gave them life. It was food, water, passage, and reflection. They believed it held memory, not metaphorically, but truly, that every splash echoed a past action. Every ripple carried the voice of an ancestor. Each morning began with silence, listening, watching, not out of fear, but out of respect. In spring, when the shad and herring ran thick through the river's veins, the people wove funnel-shaped fish traps from swamp reeds, anchoring them between submerged logs. They didn't take all, only what was needed. Children were taught early. The forest gives if you give back. They hunted deer with arrows tipped in knapped stone, carefully flaked until they could cut hide clean. They stalked the prey barefoot, moving slow, patient, and low. To startle the forest was to dishonor it. Even in death, an animal was treated with ritual. Smoke from burning cedar was offered, and words of thanks were whispered to its spirit. Their shelters were not built into the land, but with it. Bent saplings lashed with sinew, covered in bark and woven grass. Homes that breathed, homes that could be moved when the time came. They did not build fences. Fire was their oldest companion, not just for warmth or cooking, but for shaping life. Coals were used to hollow out trees into canoes, long, lean vessels that glided through the black water without a sound. One such canoe, discovered in the mud near Nassawango Creek, measured over 20 feet and dated back more than 800 years. A ghost of engineering, preserved in silt and time. The Pocomoke knew every plant, not as names in a book, but as neighbors. The bloodroot, when crushed, could stop bleeding. The sweet gum resin, chewed raw, soothed the stomach. The wax myrtle, burned in bundles, repelled insects and evil spirits alike. Women were the keepers of this medicine, passing it through generations, not with parchment, but with memory. Each season came with lessons. In summer, berries and cattail roots were gathered. In autumn, acorns were leached in river water to remove bitterness, then pounded into flour. Winter was for drying meat, mending tools, and storytelling. Sitting in a circle of elders as flames, danced shadows across bark walls. They told of creation, how the black water was formed from the tears of a sky spirit, mourning the death of the first tree. How each mist in the forest was a spirit crossing over. These were not stories to entertain. They were reminders, they were laws, and at the center of it all was balance. There was no hierarchy of man over beast, of hunter over hunted. The beaver had just as much right to the stream as the canoe. The owl's cry was not a warning, but a conversation. Even death was part of a larger rhythm, an offering to feed new life. The Pocomoke didn't conquer the forest. They became indistinguishable from it. But even here, in this quiet harmony, change crept like shadow. The first signs were small. The flight of birds disrupted by strange sails on the horizon. The sound of metal clanging where there had only been wood. Pale men with beards and armor, speaking in staccato tones, offering beads and cloth in exchange for land and knowledge. At first, the Pocomoke watched. They listened as they always had. They taught the newcomers how to survive, how to plant corn, how to trap eel, how to make a fire with damp wood and flint. They watched as the strangers took these gifts, and took more. They built fences, cleared groves, cut trees that had stood for generations. Still, the Pocomoke waited. Still they listened. But the balance had been broken. By the mid-1600s, their numbers dwindled. Disease swept through the villages, invisible and merciless. Children with fevered brows, elders who no longer remembered the healing songs. And still, the settlers came. Hungry for land, deaf to the whispers of the forest. Some tribes fled inland, deeper into the woods. Some merged with neighboring people, the Nanticoke, the Assateague. A few remained, clinging to traditions, speaking in hushed tones as their world narrowed. And yet, not everything was lost. In the quietest parts of the forest, if you know where to look, you'll still find traces. A piece of worked flint buried in the mud. A ring of stones long overtaken by moss. The faint imprint of a trail no longer used, but not forgotten. Modern descendants of the Pocomoke still walk these lands, still listen to the trees, still light cedar when the moon is high. Their stories were never written in books. They were carved into memory, into blood, into silence. They are not ghosts. They are survivors. And though the forest has changed, though machines now roam where moccasins once stepped, some things remain. The river still flows black. The cypress still rise tall. And if you move slow and breathe deep and open yourself to the hush beneath the wind, you may hear them. The children of the black water, still here, still watching, still whispering. They came from the sea, not quietly, like the deer that step through morning fog, not reverently, like those who had walked these woods for 1,000 years. The strangers came with sails, stretched by wind, boots hardened by stone, and eyes filled not with understanding, but with ambition. Their ships arrived along the Chesapeake in the early 1600s, wooden hulks bristling with iron and fear. Some sought profit, others salvation. But none were prepared for what waited in the interior. Word spread among them. a vast forest to the east, where the trees grew too close and the light never touched the ground. The locals called it Pocomoke, a place of black water and endless shadow. They heard stories from the Nanticoke and the Choptank, whispers of spirits that walked on water, of thick fogs that swallowed entire hunting parties. But the Englishmen didn't listen. They measured the land in acres, not ancestors. And so, armed with muskets, powder, and prayer, they entered the forest. They expected open space. They found walls of cypress and swamp. They expected dry ground. They stepped into muck that pulled at their legs like drowning hands. They expected dominion. They found themselves lost. The journals of a settler named Robert Claggett tell of his first glimpse. The trees here do not end, nor part for man's path. They drink the light. We felled 5 today, and it felt as if we wounded something alive. The colonists hacked and burned, carving out tiny clearings in a green prison. With crude stone axes and sweat-slick saws, they began to raise what they called cabins, rough-hewn structures of pine and clay, barely enough to hold back the wind. But food ran thin. Salted pork spoiled in the damp. The swamp offered no farmland, only roots and bracken. And so, they watched the natives. From the shadows, they observed the people of the Black Water, how they moved silently through the woods, how they wove nets that caught fish by the dozens, how they started fire with a twist of stick and patience. Desperation broke pride. One cold spring, an Englishman named Samuel Breyer crossed the river alone, unarmed and hungry. He offered beads and copper buttons in exchange for maize. The Pocomoke elder accepted, not with words, but with bread, smoked eel, and a fire to warm his hands. Breyer returned the next day, and the next, trade had begun. Soon, iron knives flowed into native hands. In return came furs, dried meats, and wild herbs. Some settlers learned the forest's tongue, how to read the bark for water, how to listen for the cough of deer, how to track beaver with bare feet and instinct. The two worlds touched, briefly, but trust, once tested, becomes brittle. A settler stole a bough. A native was caught spying near a cabin. A musket fired in panic during a meeting. Blood marked the soil. And when blood is spilled in the Pocomoke, the forest remembers. In 1643, a small band of settlers vanished while mapping a trail east of Snow Hill. No signs of struggle, no bodies, only a tattered coat hanging in the trees and a crude arrow embedded in the bark. The colony blamed the Pocomoke. Retaliation followed, swift and merciless. Cabins became blockhouses. Windows were shuttered with timber. Men stood watch with loaded muskets, while wives whispered prayers in corners. The forest, once feared for its wildness, now became the battleground of revenge. Still, they pressed forward. More ships, more settlers, more axes. They cleared land with fire, controlled burns that choked the air with ash and drove animals from their dens. Where there was once chorus, frogs, crickets, birds, now there was silence, broken only by the strike of hammer on wood. By the 1670s, the English had claimed the land by law. On parchment, Pocomoke was no longer a spirit's realm. It was a tract, a deed, a boundary drawn by ink and arrogance. But law does not quiet the trees, and the colonists knew it. They spoke less openly now, kept to paths, warned their children not to stray near the river at dusk. Old stories crept into firelight, of shapeless figures glimpsed between trunks, of laughter echoing when no one spoke, of men who wandered too far and returned speaking nonsense, or not at all. Some say the forest resisted not with violence, but with madness. A young minister, Josiah Reeve, arrived from England in 1681 to bring salvation to the frontier. He built a church from felled cedar and preached every Sunday to a growing congregation. But in his final sermon, he stepped into the aisle and declared, "This land will not be saved. It is old, older than sin. It watches, and it waits." He vanished that night. Only his cloak remained, draped over the altar. And still, they stayed. Because even fear bends to hunger. Even dread gives way to survival. The settlers adapted. They took what they needed, and often more. They wove Pokemoki fishing techniques into their routines. They planted beans and squash in the high ground. They insulated their cabins with moss and mud, built smokehouses from old stumps. Children born in the forest learned not from England's books, but from the land's unspoken rules. It shaped them, hardened them. The divide between native and settler had widened, yet their roots tangled deeper in the same soil. And then, a great silence. By the early 1700s, the Pokemoki people had all but disappeared from written record. Some fled, some perished, some remained, hidden in plain sight, changing names, cloaking rituals in Christian ceremony, burying memory beneath survival. The land did not weep. It simply waited. Those first settlers are long gone now. Their cabins rotted, their names weathered from stone. But walk the trails today, and you'll find fragments, a rusted hinge half buried in clay, a sunken hearth of brick overtaken by vine, bones that once knelt before a fire, now feeding roots. The forest does not forget. The strangers came, and they were not prepared. They came to tame the land, and instead they were changed by it. Forever. The Pokemoki does not give easily. It resists the blade, it swallows sound, and it watches every move made within its shadow. By the early 1700s, settlers in these woods understood something the maps never showed, that survival here wasn't about taming the land, it was about enduring it. The forest didn't yield to ambition, only to patience, and to tools sharpened not just by steel, but by desperation. Axes, hatchets, draw knives, fro wedges. These weren't just instruments, they were lifelines. The forest was thick with cypress, pine, and red maple, trees older than memory, with roots tangled like fists below the surface. A man might spend a day felling just one, sweating through homespun wool, hands blistered, sleeves soaked through with swamp water and blood from thorn-slashed skin. The axe was the frontier's signature sound, a slow, rhythmic ring that echoed through morning mist, not swung with force, but with understanding. The best woodsmen didn't chop, they coaxed, following grain, reading bark, knowing when to let the tree fall and where it would go. Once down, logs were split by wedge and maul and shaved smooth with draw knives, long curved blades pulled with both hands. The wood was shaped not into elegance, but function. Timbers for walls, planks for floors, puncheon slabs for steps. Every nail hammered was one less wound in the hands. Roofs were made from bark, peeled sheets of pine or cedar, softened in boiling water, layered and tied with raw hide or swamp vine. Chimneys, where they existed, were built from river clay mixed with moss, hand-packed and dried in the sun. They cracked, they smoked, but they kept the cold out, if only a little. There was no margin for error. Fire was both salvation and threat. A poorly banked ember could consume an entire homestead in hours, a nightmare that occurred more than once, leaving families with only the clothes on their backs and the sound of ash whispering in the wind. And then, there was water. In Pokemoki, it is everywhere, underfoot, overhead, in the very breath of the forest. But drink the wrong pool, and the fever comes. A slow, drowning heat in the skull. Settlers learned to dig shallow wells, lining them with clay, covering them with bark to keep out insects. Others followed native ways, boiling, straining, sweetening with birch sap or sassafras root. Food came hard. Hunting required more than a musket. In this forest, the thick underbrush meant stalking close, almost within reach. Snares were set along known paths, loops of sinew or bent saplings rigged to pull tight at a single misstep. The natives had taught the value of patience, of stillness. A man who moved too fast went hungry. Fishing was done by hand or by trap. Fish weirs, clever fences of sharpened sticks driven into the riverbed, created underwater pens where fish were funneled and caught. Simple, silent, deadly efficient. In the evening, when the water calmed, one could see the flicker of silver tails behind the reeds. A good haul meant 3 days of meat, smoked, salted, strung up in the rafters with twine. They cooked in pits, dug into the earth, lined with hot stones, covered with leaves, meat wrapped in bark, roots turned soft. It took hours, but it left no scent to lure predators, or worse, thieves. Light was rare. When the sun went down, the forest closed in. Candles were a luxury. Oil was scarce, so they made torches, bundles of dried reeds soaked in pine resin, bound with leather cord. They burned fast, bright and smoky. But they kept the shadows back, at least for a while. Inside those crude homes, children slept wrapped in animal skins. Floors were dirt, swept clean with bundled twigs. Cold drafts crept through every seam. Nights brought the groan of trees shifting in wind, the cry of foxes. Sometimes something more, and always the weight of the forest pressing in. A settler named Caleb Rohn wrote in his journal, dated 1726, "I hear them in the swamp, though they walk without feet. The fire burns, but the dark presses closer. I have taken 3 deer this week, but I would give them back if I could find peace." There was no peace, only rhythm, wake, work, watch. Women gathered roots and herbs, not for flavor, but for healing. Wild ginger to settle the stomach, bone-set tea to break fever, slippery elm bark to ease wounds. They made poultices with bear fat and clay. They knew the look of blood gone sour, of breath rattling in a chest that would not rise again. Children learned early. They were given small blades, taught to carve, to trap, to sew sinew through split hides. By 10, a boy could field dress a rabbit. By 12, he could hold a line on a 2-man saw. There was no childhood, only instruction. Every lesson was a thread in the fabric of survival. And yet, even here, even in the heart of hardship, there was beauty. A glint of light on a calm river. The scent of cedar smoke rising through morning fog. The hush before dawn when even the insects held their breath. In those moments, the settlers and the land were not enemies. They were equals, both scarred, both enduring. Some began to understand what the natives had known all along, that the forest was not something to beat, but something to belong to. They copied the design of bark canoes, learning to heat and shape wood with steam rather than force. They watched birds to find safe crossing points. They planted in the spaces where sunlight touched the ground, however briefly. They began to listen, and still, every tool mattered. A hatchet left behind could mean starvation. A fire gone cold could mean death by frost. A snapped bowstring, a rotted canoe, a misread trail. Any one of these could end a life without warning. This was life on the edge, not of civilization, but of existence itself. By the 1740s, some families had been in the Pocomoke for 3 generations. They spoke in rough accents, wore tattered buckskin, and moved with the confidence of those who had bled into the land and been accepted. But their tools still hung at the door, oiled, sharpened, ready, because the forest never stopped testing them, and it never will. It began, as so many endings do, with a silence that felt unnatural. By 1658, the Pocomoke River Valley, once the realm of shadowy hunters and whispered stories, had changed. New cabins dotted the banks. Smoke rose daily from chimneys where once only mist lingered. Trails had become roads. Roads led to mills, and the forest was shrinking. But not everyone had vanished. The Pocomoke people, those children of the Black Water, had not surrendered their home. They had retreated, first from the river's edge, then deeper into the untouched interior, where maps ended and moss grew thick enough to bury footprints. They watched, they waited, and they remembered. The settlers believed the worst had passed. That the Indian problem, as colonial officials wrote it, was now a matter of containment, something to be managed with treaties, promises, and fences. But the forest was never managed. It only endured, and it had not forgotten the blood spilled on its soil. The spark came with an insult. A trader named Elias Broom, known for his cruelty and sharp tongue, was found dead along a logging trail, throat cut, musket missing. His mule wandered back to the fort alone, reins dragging, coat slick with rain. The settlers blamed the Pocomoke. No proof, no witnesses. Just the old fear rekindled like a buried coal caught wind. A posse was formed, 17 men with muskets, pistols, and torches. They moved into the swamp, not to ask questions, but to punish. They never came back. Days later, the river turned red at dawn, not from blood, but from a thick fog that rolled in like a living thing. It clung low, turned the pine tops to grey silhouettes. The settlers called it the Red Mist, a warning, a curse. Some said it wasn't weather at all, that it was the breath of the forest itself, rising in defence. The rebellion had begun. It wasn't a war in the conventional sense. There were no declared battles, no fields, no flags. This was survival warfare, taught by centuries of woodland skill and fought in shadows. A settler named Ruth Edison remembered it in her diary. We could not see them, but we felt them. The trees whispered different now. The dogs refused to go into the marsh. One night, a torch vanished from the stable. The next, our traps were sprung and empty. Everyone. Ambushes became legend. A group of woodcutters disappeared outside Cypress Landing. All that remained was a tree marked with red clay and a circle of fresh animal bones. A patrol along Nassawango Creek found themselves surrounded by reeds that rustled with more than wind. Arrows flew silent and fast. No time to reload, no time to flee. One survivor crawled home, half blind with blood, whispering only 2 words: ghost warriors. And in truth, they moved like ghosts. The Pocomoke used every inch of their homeland. They cut canoes from fallen logs and floated them silently beneath the fog. They used deer entrails to bait settlers into traps, then vanished into tunnels of briar and moss. They painted their faces with ochre and ash, their bodies bare, their weapons silent, flint-tipped and blood-tested. Even settler forts became prisons. They feared to leave at night, fires were kept low, guards were doubled, and still, the red mist returned. One winter night, the fort at Old Church Hollow was found abandoned, no sign of struggle. Doors wide open, food on the table. Only a single mark burned into the wood above the hearth, the outline of a hand, fingers splayed wide, drawn in charcoal and rust. No one knew what it meant, but everyone felt what it meant. Panic breeds cruelty. Retaliations grew brutal. Entire native villages were razed. Old women shot where they slept. Children hunted like animals. Livestock poisoned, water tainted. The forest wept smoke and blood. But for every attack, there was silence. The kind that follows murder. The kind that buries truth. By 1664, the skirmishes had slowed. The trails quieted. The traps were no longer sprung. The red mist came no more. It wasn't victory, it was absence. The Pocomoke had disappeared. Some said they fled south, merging with other tribes, the Akahannock, the Nanticoke, the Assateague. Others believed they went deeper, into the parts of the forest no man dared chart. A few whispered darker things, that they were still there, just unseen, listening, waiting. Colonial records from that year mention the end of hostilities, but not the price. There are no treaties, no burial sites, no names remembered. The forest, once filled with their language, now echoed only axes and English hymns. But the land never forgets. On storm-heavy nights, old farmers swore they saw figures between the trees, faces streaked with mud, eyes like coal, still carrying the silent fury of a stolen homeland. Footsteps in the moss, drums without source, whispers in dead tongues, and the mist. Sometimes it comes back, reddish, low, crawling over the river like smoke from a fire that was never fully extinguished. They called it rebellion, but it was something deeper. A final, desperate breath from a people being erased, not just from land, but from memory. Not a war, not a victory, but a vanishing. And though history rarely speaks their names, the trees do. If you stand alone in the forest just before dawn and breathe the still air, you might hear them, still waiting, still whispering, still here. After the blood dried and the battles stopped echoing through the cypress, the forest did not return to peace. It held something deeper, a stillness that wasn't calm, but waiting. By the early 1700s, the Pocomoke woods had changed. The trees still stood. The river still flowed. But those who walked beneath the canopy felt it. The air had grown heavier, as if soaked with something unseen. Travelers began to speak in low voices. Doors were barred tighter at night. Fires were kept burning longer, not just for warmth, but for protection. It wasn't what you saw. It was what you felt, when no one was there. The stories began as whispers, dismissed at first, passed between firelight and drink. A trapper who'd gone deep into the marshlands claimed he saw a figure standing atop the black water. No boat, no movement, just a tall, still shape with antlers on its head and eyes that glowed like amber coals. When the man blinked, it was gone. But the canoe had drifted back to shore without him realizing it. He never trapped alone again. Another settler swore she heard children's laughter echoing from the trees near dusk, though there were no children for miles. And when she followed the sound, she found tiny handprints in the mud, leading nowhere. Some tales grew more terrifying. A woodsman returning from Snow Hill claimed to have seen a rider near the trails, but not on the path. The man was mounted high on a dark horse, just inside the tree line, gliding alongside the traveller in complete silence. The horse's hooves made no sound. The rider wore no face, only a veil of smoke where his head should have been. When the trail turned, the rider disappeared. The man abandoned his wagon at the next clearing and ran 20 miles on foot. He never went near the swamp again. These weren't just campfire stories, they were warnings. A new kind of fear had settled in Pocomoke, not of man or beast, but of what remained. The old folks called it the ghosts left behind. They said the land had memory, that it held the grief of those betrayed, the rage of those burned out of their homes, the sorrow of children buried beneath unmarked trees. And in places where that memory ran deep, the veil grew thin. Strange lights were seen dancing above the marsh water, flickering, bluish orbs that hovered in silence and blinked out when approached. Some said they were swamp gas, others souls trapped between worlds. One settler followed them for half a mile before waking at dawn, lying face down in cold mud with no idea how he got there. Another woman, a healer from the edge of the woods, claimed the mist spoke to her, that it carried names in it, names of the dead. Her neighbours feared her. She was found drowned in 2 feet of water, eyes open to the sky, mouth still moving as if mid-sentence. Even the animals seemed to know. Dogs refused to enter certain groves. Horses bucked and refused to be led down specific trails. Hunters swore the forest grew too quiet just before something strange happened, like the breath of the land had been sucked away. The settlers began to name places after the stories: Witch's Bend, Whispering Hill, Red Clay Run. A twisted pine grove near the southern bog came to be called Deadman's Teeth, after 3 farmers vanished there, and the only thing recovered was a jawbone embedded in a tree. And always, the red mist returned. It would drift low in summer, just before sunrise, thicker than fog, darker than dew. Some believed it was just the swamp breathing. Others knew better. They said it only came when something was walking the land. something that had once lived and no longer belonged. They said it came to watch. Colonial clergy tried to stamp out the stories, called them pagan nonsense, fear-driven fables. But they too began to change their routes home, began to light candles they once dismissed. Even they whispered prayers more often near the edge of the woods, because fear, when repeated long enough, becomes truth. One tale, passed down for generations, tells of a trader who cheated a Pocomoke woman, trading glass beads for her father's burial grounds. That night, he heard knocking beneath the floorboards of his cabin. Not on them. Beneath them. He ignored it. By dawn, his hair had turned completely white. He spoke only in the native tongue from then on, though he had never learned it. He disappeared a week later. They say she came for him. Another tells of the wet walker, a figure that drips even in drought, leaving pools of brackish water wherever it goes. It's said to move toward warmth, fires, breath, beating hearts. No one has seen its face. Those who claim to have seen it can no longer speak. The stories grew, generation by generation, each one layering over the last like pine needles on forest floor, soft at first, then forming a bed of lore so deep no one could separate myth from memory. And maybe that's how the forest wants it. Because for those who stayed, those who raised children along the black water and taught them to trap, to watch the sky, to never stray past dusk, these stories weren't fantasy. They were code, a way to survive in a place that never forgot what had been done. The forest doesn't hold grudges, but it remembers balance, and for every settler's sin, for every native life stolen, for every fire that burned a longhouse to ash, something was owed. The stories became the interest on that debt, paid in fear, paid in caution, and paid in silence. Today, few remember the names of the tribes that walked here first, but they remember the legends, they remember the lights, the whispers, the things in the trees, and the red mist. Always the mist. You can walk the trails now. You can paddle the river. You can build your house and plant your garden. But at night, when the frogs go quiet, and the fog hangs low, and the pine branches creak without wind, you will feel it. That weight, that watching, that cold breath on the back of your neck, and somewhere, just out of reach, a whisper in a tongue older than stone. The ghosts were never gone. They were left behind, and they are still here. By the turn of the 18th century, the wilderness had not been tamed, but it had been challenged. In a bend of the Pocomoke River, where the black water curled like a sleeping serpent, a clearing opened. Small at first. A single dock, a few cabins, a bartering post. But with each passing year, the logs grew straighter, the roads firmer, and the voices louder. They called it Snow Hill. It wasn't much, not by the standards of Williamsburg or Philadelphia, but out here, in the shadow of the forest, it was a statement, a promise that man could build something, even if the trees never stopped watching. The town was born not from wealth, but from necessity. The river, though dark and narrow, was deep enough to carry trade. Flatboats floated down from the swamps, loaded with cypress lumber, otter pelts, salted fish, and pine tar. Traders from across the Chesapeake came to barter, to sell, to drink. At the center of it all stood the forge. A blacksmith named Ezekiel Marsh, formerly a militiaman, ran it with one good hand and an eye ruined by powder flash. He made horseshoes, wagon pins, even nails, which were as precious as coin out here. Every blow of his hammer echoed down the muddy lanes, mixing with the cries of gulls and the creak of rope on timber. Across from him, the church rose, plank by plank, under the eye of Reverend Alton Frey, a preacher who claimed to have been delivered from the swamp fever by divine intervention. His sermons were long, his gaze hollow, and his faith uncompromising. He warned often of the devil's hand in the fog. He had seen too many vanish to believe otherwise. Law followed faith. A constable's office opened, a simple shed with a ledger, a musket, and a set of manacles hammered from repurposed wagon parts. There were no prisons. Punishment here was swift and visible. Stocks in the square, lashes behind the church, or exile, back into the forest. Snow Hill grew slowly, like a wound scabbing over. Each new family brought skills the frontier demanded: coopers to shape barrels, tanners to cure hides, millwrights to harness the river's slow current into labor. But no matter how much wood was cut or how many walls were raised, the town never forgot where it was, because the forest never let them. The Pocomoke wasn't just beyond the fence line, it encircled them. Trees lined every road, grew up against every homestead. The mist came in at dusk like a reminder. The sounds at night, owls, branches snapping, the occasional scream mistaken for foxes, kept the windows shut and the lamps burning long. People didn't talk about it during the day, but they felt it. Even as trade blossomed, even as coin changed hands and the first taverns opened, Snow Hill lived with 1 foot in civilization and 1 foot in shadow. There was always loss. A fur trader named Tommy Gall, known for his silver tongue and muddy boots, disappeared one spring while tracking beaver downriver. They found his canoe upside down, wedged between 2 stumps, his pack and rifle still inside. No sign of a struggle, just gone. Others said he took the money and ran. But the old woodsmen shook their heads. They'd seen too many like him, those who thought they could outwit the land. The forest didn't take vengeance, it took silence. Still, Snow Hill pressed on. The tavern, the hollow drum, became a center of town life. Not just for drink, but for story. Each night, smoke curled from its hearth as voices filled the rafters with laughter, warnings, and tales too strange to be called lies, yet too real to dismiss. They spoke of travelers who'd heard drums at night, far from any gathering, of a woman who carved faces into bark and claimed she could hear them speak when the wind turned cold, of trails that looped in on themselves, leaving men walking for hours in circles, though their compasses pointed straight. And always, the old warnings returned. Don't go past the river bend at night. Don't whistle after dark. Don't answer if the forest calls your name. It wasn't just folklore. It was etiquette. Because beneath the bustle of lumbermen and barge captains, everyone knew Snow Hill wasn't planted on safety. It was surrounded by memory, by a land that once fought back, and maybe still did. Children were raised with reverence for the edge of town. They learned to trap, to fetch water, to split wood, but also to listen, not for animals, but for wrong sounds. Too much quiet, too sudden a shift in the wind. These were the signs that something had stepped from the trees. A few spoke of the watchers, figures seen from afar, standing still, just past the tree line, not moving, not blinking, vanishing when looked at directly. Some said they were spirits of the old tribes, others, something older still. The town's clerks never wrote them down, but the children remembered, and yet the town held. Snow Hill became a waypoint, a port, a place to rest before moving deeper inland. Roads were carved towards Salisbury and Berlin. Trade expanded. Letters came from Annapolis. There was talk of a courthouse. But even as deeds were signed and markets opened, there was a reluctance, a subtle resistance. Few ever built homes on the far side of the river. The trees were too thick, the ground too soft, and the air different. You could feel it, the way your lungs tightened, the way the birds stopped singing just before dusk, as if the land still whispered its own language, one older than law, older than sermons, older than man. Snow Hill endured because it respected the forest's boundary. It did not try to conquer. It coexisted. Timber was taken, but carefully. Roads cleared, but not too far. Stories told, but never mocked. And maybe that was the secret. Not fear, but humility. Because even as society grew, as law and iron replaced tooth and claw, those who thrived in Snow Hill knew this. Civilization was a thin skin. And just beneath it, the wild still breathed. The forge still burned. The church still rang its bell, and the river still flowed. Black, slow, and watchful. The town had a name, now. A map, a future. But behind it, the forest waited, not with anger, but with memory. By the early 1800s, the Pocomoke woods weren't just feared, they were needed. The tall cypress trees, ancient, rot-resistant, immune to insects, had become one of the most sought-after building materials on the East Coast. Smooth-grained and water-hardened, they were perfect for ship hulls, shingles, even coffins. And so the timber companies came. They arrived with maps, wagons, and promise. A promise of wages, shelter, and warm food. But none of it came easy, because what waited in the Pocomoke wasn't just forest. It was a trap, a green-black maze of water and root, shadow and silence. And it did not give up its dead. The men who worked these woods were hard to the bone. Many were immigrants, Irish, Welsh, Polish. Others were freedmen from Maryland's tidewater, or runaway sailors with nowhere else to go. They came for the pay, but what they found was something else entirely. They became loggers. The job began before first light. Camp was pitched on high ground, often no more than a rough circle of tents and lean-tos lashed with swamp vine. The cook fire never went out. The axes were never dry. Every morning men rose coughing from the wet cold, boots half rotted from the marsh water, and began another day chasing ghosts through the mist. The tools were simple. Double-bit axes for clean cuts. Two-man saws, long and singing with every pull, for the trunk. Felling wedges, iron spikes, block and tackle for the hauls. But none of it mattered if you picked the wrong tree. The cypress could tower 60, 70 feet high. But its roots were treacherous, wide, knotted, and spread like claws across the mud. A careless cut could send a tree falling the wrong way. Men were crushed more than once, pinned beneath 5 tons of timber, their shouts muffled by the swamp's indifference. Then there were the rafts. Once a log was stripped and trimmed, it had to move. There were no roads, only water. Logs were lashed together with chain or vine and floated downriver in wide groaning assemblies known as rafts. Steering one meant standing atop slick bark, pushing with poles, praying the current didn't slam you into a hidden root or split the bundle apart. The river could turn without warning. Its curves were narrow, its undercurrent vicious. One man, a foreman named Caleb Lott, had his leg torn open by a submerged branch while guiding a raft near Nassawango Creek. He bled into the water before they could get him back to camp. By the time they did, infection had already taken hold. They burned his leg with pine resin and wrapped it in boiled rags. He died 2 days later, delirious, whispering that something had followed him out of the mist. They buried him under the roots of a tree he never got to cut. But the forest didn't just kill with blade and water. It killed with patience. The heat in summer was crushing, not dry heat, wet, thick. Air you could drink, but never breathe. Shirts soaked before sunrise, backs blistered beneath canvas slings. Then came the insects. Not a few. Clouds. Mosquitoes so thick they turned the air black. Biting flies that chewed through cloth. Gnats that nested in your ears and nose. Men wore scarves soaked in vinegar, tucked lavender in their boots, smeared themselves in bear grease and ash. It helped. Barely. Then there were the snakes. Cottonmouth swam in the same channels the logs floated down. They curled in boots left out overnight. They dropped from low branches. Their bite was slow but sure. Swelling. Fever. Then blackness. And always, the priest arriving too late. Even so, they stayed. Because there was money to be made. And in towns like Snow Hill, a cypress beam meant wealth, trade, status. The more that came out of the swamp, the higher the buildings rose. Schools, jails, churches, even mansions. All paid for by blood and wood. And not all that blood was spilled in daylight. Some men disappeared without a scream. A logger named Jacko Price, known for singing Irish folk songs while he cut, vanished one morning before breakfast. His boots were found near the dock. One was filled with mud, the other empty. Another, a younger boy named Eddie Finch, left the camp one evening to relieve himself and never came back. They found his hat snagged on a tree. His trail led 10 yards before vanishing, not washed away, just gone. Men began to speak of the fog, not the ordinary kind, not dew or morning mist, but a wall that rolled in silent, heavy, and wrong. It came sometimes just before dawn or just after dusk, thick enough to blot out the lanterns, dense enough to deaden sound. When it passed, things were different. Trees were not where you remembered them. Tools went missing. Sometimes, people too. The old loggers called it ghost timber. The idea was simple. Not all trees wanted to be cut. Some stood with a spirit in them, old, angry, and waiting. The forest, they said, had its own memory. And when you crossed it too often, when you took without offering back, it remembered your name. One group of French loggers refused to cut a certain grove, said it was marked, the bark bled red when scratched, and birds never nested there. The company fired them. The next crew went in anyway. None returned. The camp foreman chalked it up to superstition. But the next night, the fog came down so fast the fire couldn't breathe. And by morning, the camp's mules had broken their tethers and bolted into the swamp. They were never found. Still, the work continued, because the logs had to move, the mills had to spin. The townships on the shore demanded progress, and those who questioned the cost were simply replaced. By the late 1800s, much of the prime timber was gone. The tallest cypress had fallen. The wide swamp chestnuts, carved into church beams and dock pylons. Only the hardest, deepest groves remained. Too difficult, too dangerous, or too cursed for even the boldest to try. The camps thinned, the pay shrank, and slowly the sound of saws faded from the Pocomoke. What's left now are stumps, some still standing, blackened with time, thick with moss. Others sunk beneath the mud, waiting for a hand, a boot, a body to stumble across their history. And in the deeper parts of the forest, where even maps do not go, the cypress still whisper in the wind. Their roots curl like old fingers. Their branches sway with no breeze. And every so often, a hunter or fisherman speaks of hearing a sound no bird makes. A two-man saw, faint and distant, pulling through bark that's no longer there. The forest remembers, and so do the ghosts of the men who tried to harvest its bones. By the time the 20th century arrived, the world had changed. Electric wires stretched above the Pocomoke River. Roads now traced the edges of the forest. Automobiles rumbled where once only hoof and canoe had passed. And yet, here, in this ancient, dripping cathedral of swamp and shadow, the old stories still breathed. Because some places never fully surrender to time. Here, in the black water heart of Maryland's eastern shore, the people didn't just live near the forest, they lived with it, and they carried the weight of centuries in their bones. Stories that couldn't be erased by maps or wires. Stories born not from superstition, but from survival. They spoke of witches in the trees. Not the broom-riding, spell-chanting figures of fairy tales, but women who knew the plants too well, who could speak to birds, who carved symbols in bark and whispered to wind. Healers, midwives, loners. Women with knowledge passed down in quiet voices, from Algonquin grandmothers and African mothers, through generations of women who outlived husbands and outsmarted the land. Locals said you could find them near the bend in the river, where the moss hangs thickest and the owls never hoot. They lit fires with no flame. They boiled herbs the colour of blood. They cured fever, or caused it. One name still carries weight, Vera May Talbot. She lived alone, in a shanty raised on cedar stilts near the old ferry road. Her skin was dark as pine bark, her eyes pale and unblinking. Children said she could hear lies before you spoke them. Adults said little at all. When a man from Snow Hill was found drowned in 2 feet of water with no sign of struggle, some claimed it was a curse, payment for what his father had done to Vera's mother years before. No one ever proved anything. No one ever tried. Because people understood something the law did not. The land has its own justice. Others spoke of the water spirits. Some called them the drowned. Others, simply them. Figures seen drifting just beneath the surface, eyes open, hair fanned like river grass. They didn't float. They waited. For swimmers, for boaters, for anyone foolish enough to disrespect the current or curse. Too loudly near the cypress. One boy, no older than 10, vanished during a summer baptism. The preacher turned to dip him in the water, and the boy was gone. No splash, no cry, just rings on the surface. They dragged the river for 3 days. On the 4th morning, his body was found upright, standing in the shallows, eyes wide, hands cupped as if still in prayer. No wounds, no bruises, just silence. The old women said he was taken, but returned, as a warning. And there were others. Canoes seen drifting upstream, without paddles or rowers. Lanterns glowing blue through the trees, brighter than fire, colder than moonlight. The sound of laughter, where no people lived. These were not campfire tales for amusement. They were the whispered agreements between land and people. Do not trespass beyond your place. In the backwoods, descendants of those who had survived slavery and colonization carried the stories with care. Not for entertainment, for protection. Families pass down knowledge the same way they pass down recipes and quilts. Don't swim where the lilies are thick. Don't speak your name after dark. Don't whistle at night. And always leave a gift by the water when you take from the land. Tobacco, bread, even a song. In one small chapel near Girdletree, the elders still burn sage and sweetgrass before weddings. Not because the Bible says so, but because the forest does. They remember a time when 2 newlyweds disappeared on their first night, their boat found shattered on a sandbar. No sign of struggle, no wind that night, just silence, and footprints that led into the water, but never back out. The elders say grief haunts the swamp, the grief of mothers who never saw justice, of children buried without names, of warriors betrayed, of runaways caught and dragged back to chains. That kind of pain doesn't die. It sinks into soil, into water, into memory. And sometimes it speaks. A black farmer once claimed to have seen a woman in white walk across his field just before a storm. She didn't touch the ground. She didn't speak. But the wind changed behind her, and the next day the rain spared his crops while it drowned every plot around him. He never tilled that field again, called it sacred. And when he died, he asked to be buried there, beneath the soil she had walked on. His children honored it. Others weren't so lucky. During a drought in 1917, a logging company tried to blast a new canal through the southern edge of the swamp. It was dry, brittle, easier to work. They ignored the warnings from locals, laughed off the signs. On the 3rd day, a wall of mist rolled in, choking, sudden. Men claimed their tools vanished from their hands. One fell from a scaffold. Another wandered off the path and was never found. The canal was never finished. The swamp took it back. Even today, elders remember the rhythms. The forest grows quiet before something goes wrong. The birds stop. The frogs go still. The wind dies. And then the water whispers, not in words, but in memory. Those who still live at the edge know not to speak lightly of the past, because in places like Pocomoke, the past isn't behind you. It's beneath you, breathing, waiting, and every splash, every ripple, could be something remembering your name. The camera pans wide now, through the fog, through twisted roots and leaning crosses half swallowed by vines. A low hum builds, not music, but something older. The voice returns, solemn and certain. In the end, witchcraft was never just about spells. It was about knowing. Knowing the land, the hurt, the old gods and silent graves. It was memory passed in secret when history refused to write it down. And the spirits? They were never monsters. They were guardians, witnesses, warnings. Because this forest, with its haunted water and vanished voices, remembers everything. It remembers everyone. And sometimes, when the moon is high and the wind still, it whispers back. In the end, the forest didn't disappear, and neither did its people. Not all were erased by blood or treaty or silence. Not every skill was buried beneath church bells and train tracks. Because for every acre stripped, for every voice silenced, there were those who remembered. Here, deep in the folds of the Pocomoke, beneath a canopy that has stood since before maps bore names, the old ways live again, not in defiance, but in return. It begins with a bow. Hand-carved from black locust, its grain followed carefully, with no metal tools, just stone and fire, like the ancestors did. The maker, Jonas Miles, is a direct descendant of the Pocomoke people. He speaks with his hands more than his mouth, letting the work explain what time has forgotten. He doesn't hunt to kill, he hunts to connect. For Jonas, the bow is not a weapon, it's a prayer, a tether to the ancestors who walked these trails barefoot, who tracked deer with eyes that could read the ground like scripture. He learned from his grandmother, who learned from hers. They never wrote it down. They didn't need to. Some truths are stored in muscle and breath. Beside the marshes, a woman kneels beside a patch of wild yarrow. Her name is Anita Cross, part African, part Pocomoke, all healer. She doesn't call herself a medicine woman, just a gatherer. But she knows which roots to dig for fever, which leaves draw out infection, and which berries not even birds will touch. She learned by walking, by asking, and by listening, not just to people, but to the land. She dries elderberry on cedar racks, makes salves from bear fat and pine resin. Her tinctures smell of moss and memory. And when neighbours bring her sick children, she asks them first and foremost, "Did you tell the forest thank you?" They think it's just a ritual, but it's not. It's respect. Because everything given, every remedy, every meal, every lesson in survival, comes at a price. Not in coin, in care. And if you don't give it back, eventually the forest takes something else. In another part of the woods, two brothers split cedar logs with wooden wedges. They're carving a canoe, not from kits or plans, but from memory passed through story. They say their great-grandfather paddled the same kind through these waters, trading fish and herbs with families miles apart. It was narrow, light, and silent. Perfect for a river like this, where the water tells more than the wind. They coat the hull with sap and ash, just like before. There's no rush, because this isn't a product. It's a conversation. The forest speaks, and some still know how to listen. On a colder morning, sparks fly from a spindle pressed into dry cedar. Fire by friction. No matches, no lighters, just pressure, rhythm, and breath. A coal appears, glowing like a heartbeat in the dust. It's cupped into a bundle of dried milkweed, blown gently, until flame rises from nothing. This isn't a trick. It's a test, one that the early settlers had to learn quickly, one that the tribes had known for generations. And now, in the hands of those like Sarah Emery, a schoolteacher turned bushcraft guide, the flame lives again, not for survival, but for remembrance. She teaches children how to build shelters from bark, how to filter water with charcoal and sand, how to track deer without stepping on a single twig. But more importantly, she teaches them that knowing isn't just knowledge, it's gratitude. Because the land doesn't owe you anything. It gives, if asked. And if you don't abuse it. In Snow Hill, the church still rings its bell. The tavern still serves its drinks. But just outside town, on the old trail past Whispering Oak, there's a circle of stones where no one builds. a site once used for prayer and sometimes burial, still watched over by the oldest trees. No signs, no plaques, but those who know, they stop there, and they leave something behind, a feather, a coin, a song. Because the survival of the sacred was never about endurance alone. It was about memory, about carrying forward what couldn't be destroyed, the wisdom of roots, the rhythm of fire, the dignity of knowing when to speak and when to simply be still. And that's what makes this place more than haunted. It makes it alive, not just with ghosts, but with keepers, those who do not claim to own the forest, but to serve it. Those who know that true survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about honoring what lets you live. So today, when the wind moves through the reeds, it carries voices, not of fear, but of return, of a people not lost, but waiting, of sacred things that survived. Because someone chose to remember. The forest nearly forgot them. After centuries of blood and silence, of treaties broken and trails erased, the people of the Pocomoke were said to be gone, folded into history books, reduced to footnotes and ghost stories. But that was never the full story. Because some things, the sacred things, do not die. They wait. In the quiet spaces between trees, in the muscles of those who carve and shape and mend, in the breath of elders passing secrets to grandchildren by firelight. Memory has a pulse, and here, in the Pocomoke, that pulse never stopped. It beats in the hands of Aaron Bishop, a quiet man with sharp eyes and calloused fingers, who makes bows the way his ancestors did, not to sell, not to hang on a wall, but to honor. He begins by listening, to the wood, to the water, to his own breath. Aaron walks deep into the forest, where few dare go now, searching for young hickory trees with just the right tension. Not too green, not too brittle. He tests each by feel, running his palm down the bark, whispering thanks as he selects one. Then he fells it in silence. A single clean cut. No waste. Back at his camp, he scrapes the stave smooth with a stone blade and an antler rasp. No power tools, no shortcuts. Just sweat, patience, and the slow return of something older than steel. He says, it's not the arrow that hunts. It's the memory inside the wood that finds its mark. Nearby, on a patch of sun-drenched soil beside the marsh, Lena Whitefeather gathers roots and herbs into her basket. Wild ginger, sassafras, boneset, all growing in the same sacred ground her grandmother once walked. Lena is a healer, not by choice, but by inheritance. She learned the forest the way others learn prayers, kneeling, listening, failing, trying again. As a child, she watched her grandfather boil pine resin into salve for cuts, saw her aunt brew tea from sweet fern for fever. Now she teaches those same methods to children from town, not as folklore, but as living science. She explains that plants grow where they are needed most, and pain, whether from body or memory, is always part of the medicine. Lena doesn't speak of revenge or justice. She speaks of balance, of what happens when you take more than you return. The Pocomoke taught that long ago, and now the land is teaching it again. Farther upriver, in a lean-to shaded by woven pine boughs, Marcus Glass shapes the hull of a dugout canoe. Not for show, for travel, for ceremony. He carves slowly, humming under his breath, a song passed to him by a man whose name no one remembers, but whose rhythm never faded. The canoe is cut from bald cypress, hollowed with fire, then smoothed with stone and bone. Each line in the grain tells a story, of floods, of escapes, of quiet journeys in the night. Marcus says the canoe knows the way better than he does, and sometimes he lets it choose the path. In nearby Snow Hill, tourists snap photos of the forest's edge, unaware that just beyond the trail, a small circle of children crouches over flint and cedar shavings, coaxing a coal to life with the guidance of Sarah Black, a retired biologist turned wilderness mentor. Sarah doesn't dress in buckskin or carry feathers, She wears jeans, boots, and a quiet conviction. She believes fire is a lesson, not just in friction, but in humility. You can't force it. You wait. You adjust. You listen. And when it comes, that first smoke, that trembling red ember, you honor it. Because it chose you. Sarah says she didn't find the forest. The forest let her back in. And that's the truth running beneath all of it. None of these people claim ownership of the Pocomoke. They don't seek permission from governments or maps. Their roots go deeper than deeds and paper. Their authority comes from continuity, from the unbroken chain of hands, scars, and prayers stretching back beyond the reach of record. A chain that refused to break even when history tried to snap it. They are not relics. They are not reenactors. They are survivors. The sacred, in their eyes, is not housed in temples or altars. It's in the crack of ice underfoot, the sudden hush before rain, the way a deer lifts its head when your breath gets too loud. And that sacredness, fragile, flickering, has become their compass. Because survival here has never been about conquest. It has always been about relationship, between fire and hand, between root and body, between spirit and land. When asked why they do it, why they carry on the old ways in a world of touchscreens and speed, most of them give the same answer. So someone remembers. So it isn't lost. So the forest knows we haven't all forgotten. And that answer is enough. Because memory, like fire, requires tending. Left alone, it fades, but held with care, it lights the way forward. So now, when wind moves through the cypress groves, it carries more than whispers. It carries recognition of a people who outlasted erasure, of a forest that chose to keep its own, of the sacred, not as something to be worshipped, but as something to be lived. The forest remains, and so do they, because the sacred, when protected, always survives. It is called a state park now, a place for fishing, for hiking, for summer photographs, and picnic tables. A place marked on maps and brochures, cleaned, labelled, sectioned. But beneath the signs and wooden boardwalks, something older still waits. Because the forest does not forget. Not in the way people do. Every tree in Pocomoke grew through silence. Every root wrapped itself around bones and memory. And when the wind moves low through these groves, it carries stories, not the kind found in textbooks or plaques, but the kind that rise quietly from the soil. Here, along a trail where children ride bicycles and tourists carry trail mix, once stood a cedar, long since fallen. Locals called it the blood tree. Its bark was said to sweat red in the summer heat. Some claimed it marked the site of an ambush, a skirmish between settlers and those who had always lived here. No records prove it, but still, the old ones knew to avoid it. And when it finally fell in a storm, no one touched it, not out of fear, out of respect. A mile deeper, where the trail narrows into marshland, there's a bend in the river with no name. But the elders remember. They say it was the last crossing point of the Pocomoke people, the place where families vanished into the woods, leaving no prints, no smoke, no sound. Some say they were hunted. Others say they chose to leave before the world changed too much. Either way, the trees remember the way they moved, the stillness they left behind, and now, in that same spot, the water is colder. The birds do not sing. And those who linger too long there say they feel watched, not by danger, but by memory. Modern visitors do not see it. They see sunlight through leaves, dragonflies skimming the water, clean restrooms and friendly rangers. But if they stayed just a little longer, if they waited after the sun fell, when the fog rises and the frogs go silent, they might hear it. A rustle, a breath, the soft knock of wood on wood. The forest is not trying to frighten them. It's trying to speak. Because a living land, like a living body, carries scars. And scars too have voices. At the edge of a clearing stands an old blacksmith's foundation. Just stone now, half swallowed by vines. A few nails still lie rusting in the dirt. Nothing dramatic, nothing marked. But when the light hits the ground just right, you can see the shape of a forge, the shape of effort. This was where one man, alone most nights, hammered iron into tools that settlers needed to survive. He learned his trade from a former slave. He passed it to his sons. And when fire swept through the valley in 1831, he stayed, beating back flames with soaked blankets, his arms blistered, his beard scorched. He saved the shop, but not the house. His wife and daughter died before the dawn. He never left the forest again. Now the trees grow taller around the stone, as if guarding him, as if mourning with him. 100 yards away, a family of deer moves through the underbrush, unbothered, as if they too remember. The animals never forgot the paths, even when humans did. And the river? The river always remembers. It has swallowed anger, grief, love, prayers. It has cradled the dying and carried the lost. And now it glides, black and deep, past visitors in rented canoes who laugh and dip their fingers into its current. It does not judge them, but it knows their weight. It knows how many have floated this way with heavy hearts and how many never made it back. It carries their silence with grace, because the river, like the forest, was never just scenery. It was, and still is, a witness. There are people now, scattered across the eastern shore, who still walk barefoot into the woods at dusk, not to forage, not to explore, just to remember. Some of them don't even know why they're drawn there. They only know that something in the trees feels like a hum in the bones, like a song you almost recognize. A grandmother places tobacco on the moss near a stump. A child picks up a stone and hums a tune her mother never taught her. A ranger stands alone at sunset and feels, for a moment, that he is not alone. These are not coincidences. They are echoes, and in a place like Pocomoke, echoes are sacred. Drone footage rises over the tree line now, golden light pouring through mist. The vast canopy stretches like a green ocean, hiding centuries, holding breath. No cities here, no noise but the birds and the water and the hush of memory moving through the leaves. The forest is older than the wars, older than the flags, older than the maps that tried to name it. And it will outlive us all. But it does not do so in bitterness. It endures in hope. Hope that those who walk its trails will listen, that those who rest beneath its branches will pause just long enough to ask, what came before me here? Because to remember is to return, and in returning, we become part of the land again, not masters, not owners, but stewards, carriers of the sacred silence. So the next time the wind brushes your neck in Pocomoke, when the leaves rattle though there is no breeze, when the water seems to shift around your paddle with a mind of its own, don't be afraid, don't speak, just listen. The forest has waited centuries to tell its story, and it's telling it still. There is something the Blackwater knows. It has seen centuries pass in silence, watched empires rise and fall, felt blood sink into its mud, prayers lifted from its shores, and fires reflected in its glassy eyes. And through it all, it kept moving, not in a rush, but in rhythm. Because the river does not need to speak. It remembers, even when we don't. There is a bend near the heart of the forest where the water deepens unexpectedly, a pool darker than ink, where no roots show through, and no sound ever echoes. They say that's where the old ones whisper, where the final canoe disappeared, where something sacred went under and never came back up. Or maybe it did, just not in the way we expected. Maybe it came back in the way moss clings to cedar, in the way children build fires without knowing why, in the way the wind hums a tune no one taught them. Maybe history doesn't die here. Maybe it drifts, waiting for someone to remember. The Pocomoke River was once a boundary between tribes, between colonies, between the known and the feared. Its waters mirrored both ceremony and war. Its banks held hands as deals were struck, and bled as those same deals were broken. Some called it cursed, others called it sacred. But all who came to it, settlers, warriors, loggers, wanderers, learned one truth. You do not conquer the black water. You endure it. You learn from it. You carry its silence in your chest long after you leave. There are no battleground markers along these shores, no statues to fallen chiefs or forgotten families. But if you walk these trails slowly, if you step with care and breath held tight, you'll see their shadows, not in the dark, but in the light, in the way the trees lean, in the way the frogs go quiet, in the way your heart beats faster when nothing moves. Because some places are not haunted by ghosts. They are held by memory, held so tightly, in fact, that even the birds seem to know. You'll hear them stop singing all at once, just for a moment, like they're letting something pass through. Something old, something watching. The Pocomoke was never just wilderness. It was home. To the people of the Black Water, to the first cabins, to the timber crews, to the medicine gatherers and the memory keepers. It gave them fish and firewood and refuge. And it took things too, when disrespected, when taken for granted, when forgotten. That's what water does. It reflects what you bring to it. And sometimes it holds what you can't carry. A broken bow, a name unspoken, a promise never kept. It holds them all. There's a legend, not written but told by mouth, that says the river only ever shows you what you're ready to see. Some come for a peaceful paddle and leave remembering nothing. Others feel something clutch their chest midstream, a weight, a knowing, a realization that this place is alive, that every stroke of the paddle stirs up stories, that every ripple is a heartbeat. You can't bottle that feeling. You can only listen. And when you do, you start to feel the full weight of what happened here. The lives lived on the edge of survival, the tools carved from bone and stone, the mothers who whispered to their children under the stars, knowing they might not see another spring, the men who built homes with bare hands, while the woods pressed close, watching, waiting. And then, as quickly as they came, the stories vanished beneath the moss. But not forever, because here's the truth the Black Water keeps. Nothing ever really leaves, not the songs, not the screams, not the sacred. They sink, but they remain, waiting for someone, anyone, to wade in far enough, quiet enough, to hear them again, to feel them rise and carry them forward. In every chapter of this story, the river was there, flowing past bloodied footprints, gliding beneath vanished canoes, reflecting the faces of those who tried to map, tame, or erase it. But always, it stayed itself, untouched, unspoken, enduring. So now, as we reach the end, we don't just close a book. We step back from the bank, we look over our shoulder, and we remember not just the names and dates, but the faces, the hands on flint and fire, the prayers whispered to trees, the pain, the survival, the grace. Because history doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just flows. Still, dark, endless, like the Pocomoke itself. The screen fades to the river again. This time, the water is calm, a perfect mirror of the sky above. One feather drifts across it, caught in a slow, silent current. We leave this place not with answers, but with echoes, and the Black Water, it knows them all.